Hello friends, I'm here to help you relax tonight. Tell me where you listening from. And what time is it there? I'd love to know. Now get comfortable, let go of the day's worries and let this story guide you to a calm and peaceful sleep. You deserve to feel at ease and leave all the stress behind. Subscribe now and join me for more stories to help you find peace every night. It started with a knock. Not a loud, demanding bang, just a soft, deliberate tap. 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. At 3:17 a.m. The kind of knock that feels wrong, not because of how it sounds, but because of the silence it breaks. Who's knocking at that hour? And why did it come from inside the house? Mia sat bolt upright in her bed, the sound slicing through the stillness of the night. Her room was bathed in shadows, the faint glow of her phone screen illuminating her face as she stared at the door. For a moment she thought she had imagined it. Maybe it was a dream, she told herself. But the knock came again. 3 taps, slow and deliberate, echoing softly through the house. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She reached for her phone, the screen lighting up with a mocking message. No service. The Wi-Fi was disconnected. Panic swelled in her chest as she tried to make sense of it. She was supposed to be alone. Her parents were out of town, her brother was staying at a friend's house, and no one else had a key. She climbed out of bed, her bare feet brushing against the cold hardwood floor. She tiptoed to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. The house was silent now, save for the sound of her own breathing. She wanted to convince herself it was nothing. Maybe the pipes, maybe the wind. But deep down she knew better. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Mia cracked the door open. The hallway stretched before her, dark and empty, the faint light from the street lamp outside casting long shadows along the walls. She strained her ears, listening for any sound, any movement. Nothing. Her eyes darted to the staircase at the end of the hall. Something about the shadows at the top of the stairs looked off, as if they were moving, shifting ever so slightly. She rubbed her eyes, trying to focus, but the shadows remained still. Telling herself she was imagining things, she stepped out into the hallway. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, the sound loud and jarring in the silence. She froze, holding her breath, listening for any sign that someone, or something, had heard her. But the house remained eerily quiet. She crept down the hall, each step a test of her nerves. The living room lay ahead, its darkness seeming to stretch on forever. As she reached the top of the staircase, she felt the air grow colder, a chill that seeped into her skin and made her shiver. She paused, gripping the banister, her eyes scanning the shadows below. That's when she saw it. A figure stood at the bottom of the stairs, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, with broad shoulders and completely still. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out any details, but there was something unnerving about its posture, the way it seemed to be waiting for her. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. Mia's grip tightened on the banister. "I'm calling the police," she shouted, her voice cracking with fear. No reaction. Her hands shook as she glanced down at her phone again. No service. The message mocked her, its bright letters glaring against the darkness. She looked back at the figure. It was gone. Her heart raced as she scanned the living room, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. She thought she saw movement near the front door, but when she focused, there was nothing there. She descended the stairs slowly, her legs feeling like lead. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence was deafening. When she reached the bottom, she saw it, a small piece of paper taped to the front door. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, compelled her to move forward. She peeled the paper from the door and held it up to the faint light. The message was written in a shaky, almost frantic hand. 3:17 a.m. Every night. She stared at the words, her mind racing. What did it mean? Why 3:17? And why every night? Before she could think any further, a noise behind her made her spin around. It was a soft creak, like someone stepping on a loose floorboard. She stared into the darkness, her eyes searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. She clutched the paper in her hand, her fingers trembling as she stumbled toward the kitchen. Her thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Was someone playing a sick joke? Had someone broken into the house? And if they had, why hadn't they taken anything? She reached the kitchen and flicked on the light, the sudden brightness momentarily blinding her. She scanned the room, every shadow, every corner, looking for any sign of an intruder. The room was empty. She leaned against the counter, her breathing ragged. She told herself she was safe now, that whatever had happened was over. But as she glanced at the clock on the microwave, her blood ran cold. It read 3:17 a.m. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The knock, the figure, the note, it all revolved around this exact moment. She stared at the clock, her mind struggling to process the implications. And then, just as the clock turned to 3:18, she heard it again. Tup, tup, tup. This time it came from the window behind her. She whipped around, her heart in her throat, and saw nothing but darkness beyond the glass. She hesitated, her instincts telling her to run, but she couldn't help herself. She inched closer to the window, her hand trembling as she reached for the curtain. She pulled it aside in one swift motion, her eyes locking onto the face staring back at her. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce into her soul. The figure pressed its hand against the glass, its fingers long and unnaturally thin. Mia stumbled backward, a scream caught in her throat as the figure began to tap on the window. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed in her mind, growing louder and more frantic as she scrambled to get away. She ran back toward the living room, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and confusion. She didn't stop until she was back in her bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She pressed her back against the door, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. For a moment, the house was silent again. But then, from the other side of the door, she heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Mia froze, her back pressed against the door, her chest rising and falling with panicked breaths. She held her breath, hoping, praying, that the sound would stop. But it didn't. Tap, tap, tap. Each knock was deliberate, steady, and unrelenting. Her mind screamed for her to move, to do something, but her body wouldn't obey. She felt paralyzed, every muscle in her body locked in place. She forced herself to take a step back, then another, until she was halfway across the room. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. She clenched her fists, trying to steady her shaking hands, and grabbed her phone. The screen still mocked her with the same message: no service. She opened her contacts, her thumb hovering over her dad's name. Maybe she could at least leave a message. As soon as she tapped the name, the screen flickered and went black. No, 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 she whispered, pressing the power button repeatedly. The phone didn't respond. A new sound broke the silence. This time it wasn't a knock. It was the slow, deliberate turning of a doorknob. Her head snapped toward the door. She watched as the knob twisted back and forth, the faint metallic squeak making her stomach churn. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was trying to get in. Her instincts screamed for her to run, but where? She was trapped. The window was too high to climb out of, and even if she made it to the front door, there was no guarantee she'd make it outside. The knob stopped turning, but Mia didn't feel relief. She felt dread. It was quiet again, and she knew enough now to fear the silence. Her closet door creaked open. She spun around, staring at the dark gap between the door and its frame. She hadn't opened it. She was sure of that. Her breathing grew erratic as she stared into the black void, waiting for something, anything, to emerge. And then she saw it. Two pale, skeletal hands gripped the edge of the door, followed by a face that was all wrong. Its eyes were hollow pits, and its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, as if smiling was a concept it had just learned. Mia let out a strangled scream and stumbled backward, hitting the edge of her bed. She grabbed the baseball bat she had taken earlier, clutching it so tightly her knuckles turned white. The thing climbed out of the closet slowly, deliberately, its movements unnatural like a puppet on strings. It didn't rush her. It didn't need to. Its very presence was suffocating. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The creature tilted its head as if considering her question. Then it raised a single bony finger and pointed at her. Mia's grip on the bat faltered for a moment. She swung it wildly, the motion more instinct than strategy. The bat passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke, hitting the closet door with a dull thud. The thing didn't flinch. It just stood there, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. The lights flickered, and when they steadied, the figure was gone. Mia stood there, her chest heaving, the bat still raised. She didn't lower it until her arms began to ache, and even then she didn't feel safe. Her eyes darted around the room, searching every shadow, every corner. The knock came again. Tap, tap, tap. But this time it came from inside the walls. Her breathing quickened as she turned in circles, trying to locate the source. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, as if something was clawing to get out. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to seep into her very bones. "Stop!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Please stop." And then it did. The sudden silence was deafening. She stood there, trembling, her hands still pressed to her ears. A faint whisper broke the silence, so soft she almost missed it. 3:17. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the sound, her eyes wide with terror. The alarm clock on her nightstand blinked in and out, the numbers flickering before resetting to 3:17. The whisper came again, this time louder. Every night. Mia backed away from the clock, her hands trembling so badly she almost dropped the bat. She tried to think, tried to make sense of what was happening, but her thoughts were a chaotic mess. She thought of the note, the figure, the closet, the whispers. None of it made sense, but one thing was clear. This wasn't going to stop. She grabbed her phone again, desperate for some kind of connection, some way to call for help. To her surprise, the screen lit up. A single notification stared back at her. One new message. Her hands shook as she opened it. The message was short, only 2 words. Look behind. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt the air grow colder, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She didn't want to turn around. Every instinct told her not to, but something compelled her to look. Slowly she turned her head. It was standing right behind her. It was inches away. The thing's face was closer than she could have ever imagined, its hollow eyes staring straight into hers. Its mouth hung open, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. A foul, putrid stench filled the air, making Mia gag. Her legs gave out and she collapsed onto the floor, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall. She raised the baseball bat, but her hands trembled so violently she could barely keep her grip. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, towering over her, its unnatural smile growing wider. Mia screamed, swinging the bat with all the strength she could muster. The bat passed through the figure like smoke, the momentum throwing her off balance. She hit the floor hard, the bat clattering out of reach. When she looked up, it was gone. The room was silent again, but the air felt thick and heavy, like something invisible was pressing down on her. She crawled to her feet, grabbing the bat as she staggered toward the door. Her instincts screamed at her to get out of the house, to run and never look back. She reached for the doorknob, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn it. The door swung open, revealing the dark hallway. She hesitated for a moment, listening for any sound, any movement. Silence. Mia stepped into the hallway, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. She moved slowly, gripping the bat tightly, her eyes darting to every shadow. The house felt different now, as if it were alive and watching her every move. She made her way to the stairs, her breath hitching with each creak of the floorboards. The living room was pitch black, the faint light from outside barely illuminating the space. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw it again. The figure was standing by the front door, its back to her. It was completely still, but its presence was suffocating. Mia froze, unsure of what to do. She wanted to run, to lock herself in her room and wait for morning, but she knew that wouldn't work. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by normal rules. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, she took a step forward. "What do you want?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with fear. The figure didn't respond. She took another step, her grip tightening on the bat. "Why are you doing this to me?" Slowly, the figure turned its head, just enough for her to see its hollow eyes. It raised one hand and pointed at the clock on the wall. Mia's eyes followed its gesture. The clock read 3:17 a.m. Before she could react, the figure vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. The room was silent again, but Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She backed away slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The knocking started again. Tap, tap, tap. But this time it came from everywhere. Above her, below her, from the walls around her. It was deafening, a relentless assault on her senses. She dropped the bat, clapping her hands over her ears as she screamed. "Stop it. Just stop." The knocking ceased abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Mia sank to the floor, her body trembling as tears streamed down her face. She didn't know how much more she could take. The lights flickered, and she looked up just in time to see the shadows in the room begin to move. They stretched and shifted, coalescing into shapes that resembled faces, twisted, angry faces that stared at her with hollow eyes. She stumbled to her feet, backing away from the living room and into the hallway. The shadows followed her, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were toying with her. She ran up the stairs, her heart pounding as she threw herself into her bedroom and slammed the door shut. She locked it, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. She pressed her back against the door, clutching the bat as her chest heaved. She felt trapped, as if the walls were closing in around her. The clock on her nightstand blinked again, resetting to 3:17. A whisper filled the room, soft and chilling. "Every night." Mia screamed, hurling the bat at the clock. The device shattered, the pieces scattering across the floor. But the whisper didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a deafening chorus of voices. "Every night. Every night. Every night." Mia fell to her knees, covering her ears as the voices grew louder and louder. She screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the cacophony. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The room was silent. The air was still. Mia opened her eyes, her hands still pressed to her ears. She looked around, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The clock on the nightstand was whole again, its face glowing faintly. It read 3:17 a.m. A single knock broke the silence. Tap, then another. Tap, and another. Tap. This time it wasn't coming from the door or the walls. It was coming from under the bed. Mia's breath hitched. She sat frozen, her knees pressed against her chest, staring at the floor where the sound had come from. The knocking repeated, slow and deliberate, the sound reverberating through the room as if the floor itself were alive. Tap, tap, tap. Her mind raced. She wanted to move, to run out of the room, but her body wouldn't listen. Every muscle was locked in place, her fear weighing her down like chains. The knocking stopped. Silence fell, and for a brief moment she thought it might be over. But then she heard the sound of something dragging. It was faint, like fabric scraping against wood, but it was there, coming from directly beneath her. Mia's breathing grew shallow. Her eyes darted to the baseball bat she had thrown earlier. It was too far away. If she moved now, she'd have to risk whatever was under the bed noticing her. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to take slow, measured breaths. She needed to think, to stay calm. But the sound of the dragging grew louder, as if whatever was beneath her was shifting, adjusting, preparing. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. She jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. The vibration seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence. Slowly, she reached for it, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The screen displayed a single notification. One new message. Her thumb hovered over the notification. She didn't want to open it. Every instinct told her not to, but something compelled her to tap it. The message was short. Look down. Her pulse quickened. She held the phone tightly, her knuckles turning white. The dragging sound stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. Against her better judgment, she slowly lowered her gaze to the edge of the bed. For a moment she saw nothing. Just the dark, empty space beneath the mattress. But then two eyes appeared, bright, white, and staring directly at her. Mia screamed, scrambling backward until she hit the wall. The thing under the bed began to emerge, its movements slow and deliberate. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body twisted and contorted as if it didn't belong in this world. Its face was worse than she remembered. The hollow eyes and grotesque smile were still there, but now the skin seemed to writhe and ripple, as if something was crawling beneath the surface. Mia grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the creature. It shattered on impact, but the thing didn't flinch. It kept coming, its long, spindly fingers reaching for her. She screamed again, darting toward the door. Her fingers fumbled with the lock, her heart pounding as she twisted the key. The lock clicked open just as she felt the air behind her grow cold. Without looking back, she yanked the door open and ran into the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing darker and more menacing. She ran down the stairs, her bare feet slipping on the wooden steps. She caught herself on the banister, her heart racing as she glanced over her shoulder. The creature was at the top of the stairs, its hollow eyes locked onto hers. It didn't run. It didn't rush. It simply started descending, one step at a time, its movements slow and deliberate as if savoring the chase. Mia bolted for the front door, her fingers scrambling to unlock it. The bolt wouldn't budge. She twisted and pulled, her desperation growing with each passing second. Behind her, the sound of the creature's footsteps grew louder. Thud, thud, thud. The door finally gave way and she flung it open, sprinting out into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop. She ran across the yard and into the street, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The world outside was eerily quiet. The streetlights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the pavement. She looked around, hoping to see another person, a car, anything, but the neighborhood was deserted. She turned back toward the house, expecting to see the creature standing in the doorway. But it wasn't there. The front door was closed. The house was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. Mia took a step back, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just experienced. Her phone vibrated again. She almost didn't want to look, but curiosity, or maybe desperation, got the better of her. She pulled it out of her pocket and glanced at the screen. Another message. It's not over. Her stomach dropped. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the empty street. A figure stood under the flickering streetlight, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was the same creature, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It raised one hand and pointed at her. Mia stumbled backward, nearly dropping her phone. She turned and ran, her bare feet pounding against the pavement. She didn't know where she was going, she just needed to get away. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her, slow and deliberate. She risked a glance over her shoulder. The figure was following her, its movements impossibly fast despite its slow gait. Mia's chest burned as she pushed herself to keep running. The houses blurred past her, the streetlights flickering like dying candles. She felt like she was running in circles, the neighborhood stretching on endlessly, every street looking the same. She turned a corner and stopped abruptly. She was back in front of her house. The front door was open, the dark interior beckoning her like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, this isn't real. This can't be real." The footsteps behind her grew louder. She turned to see the figure standing just a few feet away, its hollow eyes staring into hers. It raised its hand again, but this time it didn't point. It reached for her. Mia screamed as the figure's long, bony fingers stretched toward her, their icy presence so palpable it felt like they were already brushing against her skin. Her instincts took over, and she bolted back toward the house. Every rational thought told her not to go inside, but where else could she go? The street seemed endless, looping her back to this cursed place no matter how far she ran. She crossed the threshold of the house, slamming the door shut and locking it. She leaned against it, her chest heaving, her entire body trembling with adrenaline and terror. The knocking resumed. This time it was louder. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from everywhere, the door behind her, the windows, the walls. The house itself seemed alive, pulsating with the same dark energy as the figure outside. "Leave me alone," Mia cried, her voice breaking. The knocking stopped. The silence was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was waiting for something. She stepped away from the door, clutching her phone as if it were a lifeline. The screen lit up again. Another message. "You let it in." Her stomach churned. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She blinked them away, staring at the phone as if it might offer some explanation, some way out of this nightmare. A loud creak echoed through the house. Mia turned, her heart skipping a beat. The hallway was dark, but she could hear something, movement, soft and deliberate, coming from deeper inside. She backed away, gripping the phone tightly. Her hands were shaking so much she nearly dropped it. She opened the flashlight app, the weak beam of light barely cutting through the darkness. "Mia?" Her name was whispered, low and guttural, sending shivers down her spine. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice quivering. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Mia?" The beam of light trembled as she moved it toward the source of the sound. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the silhouette at the end of the hallway. It wasn't the figure from outside. It was a little girl. The child stood motionless, her head tilted slightly, her face obscured by long matted hair. She wore a tattered dress that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. "Mia," the girl whispered again, her voice echoing unnaturally. Mia froze, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of her panicked mind. The girl took a step forward. Mia stumbled back, nearly tripping over her own feet. "Stay away," she shouted, raising her phone like a shield. The girl stopped, her head snapping upright. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow black eyes that seemed to pierce straight through Mia. "You shouldn't have opened the door," the girl said, her voice overlapping with itself as if multiple people were speaking at once. Mia's throat tightened. "What do you mean? What door?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the living room. Mia followed her gaze, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room until it landed on the door to the basement. It was open. "No," Mia whispered, shaking her head. "I didn't." The door creaked, swinging open wider as if inviting her in. "You have to go," the girl said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "It's the only way." Mia's legs felt like lead. She didn't want to go anywhere near that door, but something about the girl's tone made her pause. "What's down there?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The girl's eyes flickered with something like sadness. The truth? Before Mia could respond, the girl disappeared, fading into the darkness like a wisp of smoke. The house fell silent again. Mia turned toward the basement door, her stomach twisting in knots. Every instinct told her to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But she knew it wouldn't matter. The street had looped her back here. The figure outside had pointed her in this direction. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop until she went down there. Her phone vibrated again. "Go." She took a shaky step forward, the light from her phone trembling as she pointed it at the basement stairs. The darkness seemed to swallow the beam, making it impossible to see how far down they went. Her foot touched the first step, the wood creaking under her weight. She hesitated, gripping the banister tightly as she tried to steady her breathing. Another step, and another. The air grew colder with each step she took, the oppressive silence pressing down on her like a weight. Halfway down she heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound like breathing. It wasn't hers. She stopped, straining to hear. The breathing grew louder, accompanied by a soft, wet sound, like something shifting in the darkness. She pointed her flashlight downward, but the beam barely penetrated the black void. "Mia?" The whisper was right behind her. She spun around, the light sweeping the stairs, but there was nothing there. When she turned back, she saw it. At the bottom of the stairs, something was waiting for her. It wasn't the figure from before or the girl. It was worse. The thing crouched low, its body impossibly large, its limbs twisted and contorted. Its skin was pale and slick, like it had been submerged in water for far too long. Its face was a void, a gaping, featureless hole that seemed to pull the light into it. And it was smiling. Her legs buckled and she collapsed onto the stairs. The phone slipped from her hands, tumbling down the steps and landing at the creature's feet. The light flickered and died, plunging the basement into total darkness. The last thing she heard was the sound of it moving toward her. Mia's world went black as the basement swallowed her whole. She wasn't sure if she had fainted or if the darkness itself had claimed her, but when she opened her eyes, she wasn't on the stairs anymore. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic, like blood. She was lying on a cold, uneven surface that felt like stone, her body aching as if she'd been dragged here. She sat up slowly, her head spinning. The room was dimly lit, the faint glow coming from an unseen source that cast eerie shadows on the walls. The walls themselves weren't made of wood or concrete, but something organic, pulsating faintly as if alive. "Mia?" The whisper was back, louder now, echoing through the space like a voice in a cavern. She scrambled to her feet, her bare soles slipping on the slick surface. Her phone was nowhere in sight. "Where am I?" she shouted, her voice cracking. A low, guttural laugh answered her. "You wanted answers," the voice said, each word dripping with malice. Mia turned in a circle, her eyes darting around the room. Shapes moved in the shadows, slithering along the walls and ceiling. They were too fast to make out, but their presence was undeniable. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her fists clenched despite the tremor in her hands. The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, the room began to shift. The walls stretched and contracted, the shadows twisting into grotesque figures that seemed to reach for her before dissolving into nothing. "You open the door," the voice said finally, its tone almost mocking. "You let us in. Who are you?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. The glow in the room intensified, and she could see more clearly now. The shapes on the walls weren't shadows, they were faces. Dozens of them, their features contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Mia stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. "This place, it's not real," she whispered, more to herself than anything else. "Oh, it's real," the voice replied. "Real enough to take you." The ground beneath her feet shifted, and she lost her balance, falling onto her hands and knees. The stone floor was warm now, almost burning, and she yelped as she pulled her hands away. The faces on the walls began to move, their eyes opening one by one, all of them fixed on her. "You're one of us now," they said in unison, their voices merging into a deafening roar. "No," Mia screamed, covering her ears. I'm not like you." The ground cracked beneath her, and she felt herself falling again, the air rushing past her as she plummeted into the void. She landed with a thud, the impact knocking the wind out of her. Gasping for air, she pushed herself up and looked around. She was in her bedroom. Everything was as it had been before the nightmare began. The bed was neatly made, the lamp on the nightstand unbroken, the window open just enough to let in a cool breeze. Mia blinked, her mind struggling to process the sudden shift. Had it all been a dream? She touched her arm, feeling the warmth of her own skin. It felt real, solid. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers hovering over the screen. One new message. Turn around. Her heart stopped. She didn't want to look, but her body moved on its own, her head turning slowly toward the door. It was open. Standing in the doorway was the figure, its hollow eyes glowing faintly, its twisted smile wider than ever. Mia's scream was cut off as the door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness once again. Mia's scream echoed in the darkness, swallowed almost immediately by an oppressive silence that pressed against her ears. She stumbled backward, her hands searching for anything solid to hold on to. Her fingers brushed the edge of the nightstand, and she gripped it tightly, her knuckles turning white. The room was cold, unnaturally so. Her breath puffed out in small clouds, and her skin prickled as the temperature continued to drop. She strained her eyes, hoping to see something, anything in the pitch black. But the dark was absolute. No moonlight, no faint glow from her phone, nothing. Then the whisper returned. "Mia?" It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, the voice low and guttural, as if something ancient was speaking directly into her mind. "What do you want from me?" she cried, her voice breaking. A faint glow began to spread across the room, but it wasn't coming from any light source she could see. It seemed to radiate from the walls themselves, revealing shifting, pulsating patterns that twisted and writhed like living things. Her gaze darted around the room and she froze. The figure was no longer by the door. It was standing at the foot of her bed. Its head tilted to one side, the grotesque smile stretching even wider. The hollow eyes seemed deeper now, darker, as if they led to some abyss she couldn't comprehend. "You let us in," the figure said, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones, male, female, childlike, and inhuman all at once. "I didn't," she stammered, shaking her head violently. "I didn't let anything in." The figure took a step forward, its movements unnaturally fluid, like it was gliding rather than walking. "You opened the door," it said again. "Now you'll see." "See what?" Mia demanded, backing away until her legs hit the edge of the bed. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one long, spindly finger and pointed at her. The room shifted again. The walls stretched and twisted, the pulsating patterns becoming faces, hundreds of them all screaming silently. The floor beneath her feet cracked and crumbled, revealing an endless void below. Mia tried to move, but her body felt rooted to the spot. The figure continued to point, and as it did, the faces on the walls turned their hollow eyes toward her. "You'll see what you truly are," they said in unison, their voices merging into a deafening roar. The floor gave way and Mia fell. The sensation was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. It wasn't just a physical fall, it felt like she was being pulled through layers of reality, each one darker and more twisted than the last. She landed with a jolt, her body aching from the impact. The world around her was unrecognizable. The sky was a swirling mass of black and crimson, the ground beneath her feet soft and spongy like flesh. In the distance, jagged structures jutted out of the landscape, their shapes impossible and unsettling. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is where it begins," the voice replied, echoing from all directions. Mia turned slowly, her heart pounding as she tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. But there was nothing. No figure, no faces, just the twisted alien landscape stretching out before her. "You wanted the truth," the voice continued. "Now you'll see what lies beneath." The ground began to ripple, and Mia stumbled, her hands clawing at the spongy surface for balance. Shapes emerged from the ripples, rising slowly like shadows taking form. They were people, or at least they had been. Their bodies were distorted, their limbs elongated and twisted, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Mia backed away, her chest tightening as they turned their hollow eyes toward her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This can't be real." "You've always known," the voice said, louder now, closer. Mia spun around, and there it was, the figure towering over her, its presence overwhelming. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Known what?" The figure raised its hand, and the distorted people began to move, their twisted forms lurching toward her. "You are one of us," it said, its tone almost mocking. "No," Mia screamed, turning and running. The ground shifted beneath her feet, making every step feel like she was sinking into quicksand. The distorted figures followed, their movements unnatural and jerky, but impossibly fast. She ran toward one of the jagged structures, hoping to find shelter, but as she got closer, she realized it wasn't a building. It was a mirror. The surface shimmered, reflecting the twisted landscape and the figures pursuing her. But when she looked at her own reflection, she froze. It wasn't her. The thing staring back at her had her face, but it was wrong. Its eyes were hollow, its smile grotesque, its skin rippling as if something was crawling beneath it. "No," Mia whispered, stepping back. "That's not me. That's not." The figures caught up to her, their twisted hands reaching out, pulling her toward the mirror. She struggled, screaming and kicking, but their grip was like iron. The figure appeared behind her reflection, its hollow eyes meeting hers. "This is what you are," it said, its voice echoing in her mind. The mirror shattered, and the world dissolved into darkness. Mia woke with a gasp, her body drenched in sweat. She was back in her bed, the room silent and still. But something was different. The reflection in the window wasn't hers. It was smiling. Mia's heart pounded as she stared at the reflection in the window. It wore her face, but the details were off, too pale, too still, and its smile, wide and unnerving, didn't falter even as her real lips quivered in fear. She stumbled backward, her legs hitting the edge of her bed. "Stop it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're not me. You can't be me." The reflection tilted its head slightly, the grin never fading. Its hollow eyes seemed to pierce through her, as if it were studying her from the other side of a thin, fragile barrier. "You've always known," it said, its voice faint but perfectly clear, as though it came from inside her own mind. The words sent a chill down her spine. "Known what?" Mia demanded, her voice shaky. "What are you talking about?" The reflection's smile widened, impossibly so, its mouth stretching unnaturally across its face. "That you don't belong here," it said. Mia's knees buckled, and she sat on the edge of the bed, her head spinning. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in around her. She wanted to run, to escape, but where would she go? This wasn't just a haunted house or a cursed street. This was her reality unraveling. "I'm not listening to you," she said, covering her ears. But the voice didn't stop. "You can't ignore me, Mia. I'm a part of you." "No, you're not," she screamed, standing up so quickly she nearly fell over. "You're just something else. A nightmare. A hallucination." The reflection's smile faded for the first time, replaced by an expression of eerie calm. "If that's true, then why did you let me in?" Mia froze, her blood running cold. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her throat dry. The reflection didn't answer immediately. Instead, it raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. To Mia's horror, the glass rippled like water, the barrier between them thinning. "You invited me in the moment you doubted yourself," it said. The moment you questioned what was real and what wasn't. I didn't, Mia began, but the reflection cut her off. You did. And now it's too late to undo it. The room around her began to change. The walls shimmered and dissolved, revealing a void of swirling shadows and faint, distant whispers. The floor beneath her feet softened, becoming the same fleshy, pulsating surface she had seen in the nightmare. No, Mia whispered, shaking her head. This isn't happening. This isn't real. The reflection stepped through the glass, its movements slow and deliberate. It was no longer confined to the window. It was here in the room with her. I'm as real as you are, it said, its voice calm and unrelenting. Mia backed away, her hands searching for something, anything she could use to defend herself. Her fingers brushed against the lamp on her nightstand, and she grabbed it, wielding it like a weapon. Stay back, she shouted, her voice cracking. The reflection tilted its head, its expression unreadable. What are you going to do, Mia? Fight yourself? The lamp felt heavy in her trembling hands. She wanted to throw it, to smash the thing in front of her, but something held her back. It wasn't just fear, it was doubt. What if it was telling the truth? You're lying, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The reflection smiled again, but this time, it was almost sad. You've been running from the truth your whole life, it said. But now there's nowhere left to run. The whispers in the void grew louder, surrounding her, pressing against her mind. They weren't just random sounds, they were voices, familiar and unfamiliar, calling her name, repeating the same phrase over and over. You are one of us. Mia's grip on the lamp faltered, and it fell to the floor with a dull thud. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm not. The reflection stepped closer, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. Then prove it, it said. Mia's breath hitched. What? Prove you're not like me. Prove you belong here. The ground beneath her feet rippled, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. The whispers were deafening now, drowning out her own thoughts. How? She shouted, her voice desperate. How do I prove it? The reflection crouched in front of her, its face inches from hers. You can't, it said softly, because deep down you already know the truth. Mia screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the void. She grabbed the reflection by its shoulders, her fingers sinking into its cold, unyielding flesh. You're wrong, she shouted. You're wrong? The reflection didn't resist. It simply stared at her, its hollow eyes unblinking. Am I? It asked. The void around them began to collapse, the shadows closing in. The whispers turned into a roar, a cacophony of voices screaming her name. Mia felt herself being pulled into the darkness, her body and mind unraveling. She fought against it, clawing at the ground, but it was no use. The last thing she saw before the void consumed her was her own face, staring back at her, smiling. When she woke up, she was sitting in her living room. The sun was shining through the windows, and the house was quiet and still. For a moment, she thought it was over. But when she looked at her reflection in the mirror on the wall, she saw it smile. And this time she smiled back. The end. Story 2. In the heart of a secluded town, where shadows whisper secrets and the air is thick with untold dread, a young journalist named Sarah receives a cryptic letter. It speaks of unsolved disappearances spanning decades, each more chilling than the last. Drawn by an insatiable need for truth, she ventures into this eerie enclave, unaware that every step pulls her deeper into a web of darkness. As Sarah unravels the town's sinister past, she realizes that some mysteries are better left buried. What malevolent force lurks in the corners of this forsaken place? And will she escape its grasp before becoming the next chapter in its horrifying history? Sarah's car rumbled along the winding road, the dense forest on either side casting elongated shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon. The letter, now slightly crumpled from constant handling, lay on the passenger seat. Its contents were brief but haunting. They vanish without a trace. Find the truth before it's too late. No signature, no return address. Just an ominous warning that had ignited her investigative instincts. The town of Ravenswood wasn't on any map she owned. It was as if it had been deliberately erased from existence. The deeper she drove into the woods, the more her GPS protested, eventually giving up entirely. But Sarah pressed on, guided by the hand-drawn map that had accompanied the letter. As she approached the town's outskirts, an old, weathered sign greeted her. Welcome to Ravenswood. The paint was peeling and the wood beneath was rotting, giving the impression that the town itself was decaying. The streets were eerily quiet, with only the occasional flicker of light from curtained windows suggesting any life at all. Sarah parked her car near the town square, where a dilapidated fountain stood as a testament to better days. She stepped out, the cool evening air sending a shiver down her spine. Clutching her coat tighter, she glanced around, hoping to find someone who could provide answers. The local inn, the Raven's Nest, seemed as good a place as any to start. Its exterior was worn, but a dim light glowed from within. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, Sarah was greeted by the scent of aged wood and something else she couldn't quite place, something metallic. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with piercing blue eyes, looked up from her ledger. "Evening," she said, her voice raspy. "Looking for a room?" "Yes, please," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "And perhaps some information about the town?" The innkeeper's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not much to tell. Quiet place. Folks keep to themselves." Sarah nodded, sensing the woman's reluctance. "I understand. But I've heard there have been incidents. People disappearing?" The innkeeper's expression hardened. "Old tales. Best left in the past." Before Sarah could press further, the woman handed her a tarnished key. "Rooms upstairs, third door on the right. Supper's at 7. Taking the key, Sarah offered her thanks and made her way up the creaking staircase. The hallway was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling in places, revealing moldy patches beneath. Her room was modest, a simple bed, a wooden dresser, and a small window overlooking the town square. As she unpacked her belongings, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sensation was subtle, like an itch at the back of her mind. She approached the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. The square below was deserted, but a movement caught her eye, a figure slipping into an alleyway, their form swallowed by the shadows. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah decided to explore the town before supper. She grabbed her notebook and camera, tools of her trade, and ventured back downstairs. The innkeeper was nowhere to be seen, and the lobby was empty, save for the ticking of an old grandfather clock. Outside, the streets were cloaked in twilight. The few townsfolk she encountered avoided her gaze, their faces etched with unease. Sarah approached a middle-aged man tending to a withered garden. "Excuse me," she began. "I'm new in town and was hoping to learn more about Ravenswood's history." The man glanced up, his eyes darting nervously. "Ain't much to say," he muttered, returning to his work. "Please," Sarah pressed. "I've heard stories of people disappearing. Is there any truth to them?" He paused, his hands trembling slightly. "Best not to go poking around, miss. Some things are better left alone." Before she could ask more, he retreated into his house, the door closing with a definitive thud. Frustrated but undeterred, Sarah continued her exploration. The town's architecture was a mix of colonial and Victorian styles, though most buildings showed signs of neglect. An old church stood at the end of the main street, its steeple reaching toward the darkening sky. Drawn to it, Sarah made her way to the entrance. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Rows of pews faced a simple altar, above which hung a large, weathered cross. The air was thick with the scent of incense and something else, something acrid. As she stepped further inside, a voice echoed from the shadows. "Can I help you?" Startled, Sarah turned to see a man emerging from a side door. He was tall and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce through her. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to intrude. I'm Sarah, a journalist. I'm looking into the disappearances that have occurred here." The man's expression remained unreadable. "I'm Father Donovan. This town has seen its share of tragedies, but digging into them won't bring peace. People deserve to know the truth," Sarah insisted. Father Donovan sighed, his shoulders sagging. "The truth is a heavy burden. Are you prepared to carry it?" Before she could respond, the church's doors slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the nave. Sarah's heart raced as she turned to see a figure standing by the entrance, a young woman, her eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "You have to leave." "Who?" Sarah asked, stepping closer. "Who's coming?" But the woman backed away, her gaze darting around the church. "They watch. They listen. Trust no one." With that, she fled through a side door, leaving Sarah and Father Donovan in stunned silence. "Who was that?" Sarah demanded. Father Donovan shook his head. A troubled soul. Pay her no mind. But Sarah couldn't shake the woman's words. Determined to find answers, she decided to stay in Ravenswood, unaware of the darkness that awaited her. As night fell, Sarah returned to the inn for supper. The dining room was modest, with a few wooden tables and chairs. A single chandelier cast a dim light over the room. The innkeeper served a simple meal of stew and bread, her demeanor as cold as before. Sarah ate in silence, her mind racing with questions. The townsfolk's reluctance to speak, the mysterious woman in the church, and the ominous warning in the letter all pointed to something sinister lurking beneath Ravenswood's surface. After supper, she retired to her room, hoping. The night in Ravenswood was unlike any Sarah had ever experienced. As the small town fell into a near-complete silence, the air seemed heavier, almost oppressive, as if the darkness itself carried a weight. Sarah lay on the creaking bed in her dimly lit room, her thoughts racing with fragments of the day, the cryptic warnings, the cold glares, and the eerie figure in the church. She checked the time on her phone, 11:37 p.m. Sleep eluded her. The gnawing feeling of being watched returned, sharper than before. She got up and peeked through the window. The square below was desolate, bathed in pale moonlight, yet something about it seemed off. Movement caught her eye again. This time it wasn't a shadow or an imagined flicker. A figure stood at the fountain. Cloaked in black, its features obscured, it didn't move, didn't turn, simply stood there as if waiting for something, or someone. Heart pounding, Sarah grabbed her camera and slipped into her coat. She had to know who or what it was. Quietly, she crept down the stairs and out the inn's front door. The cold air hit her like a slap. The figure was still there, unmoving. She approached cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the dirt road. When she was just a few feet away, the figure turned sharply and Sarah froze. A face, pale and gaunt, stared back at her. Its eyes were hollow, its expression blank yet disturbingly intense. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered in a voice that seemed to echo from far away. Before she could respond, the figure dissolved into the shadows. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving only the faint scent of something metallic and sour behind. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched her camera. She hadn't even managed to take a single photo. Her instincts screamed for her to retreat to the safety of her room, but curiosity, or something deeper, urged her forward. She circled the fountain, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. On the ground, near where the figure had stood, she found something, a small, rusted locket. She picked it up carefully. The metal was ice cold, and inside was a faded photograph of a young girl, no older than 10, with a hauntingly familiar smile. Returning to the inn, Sarah examined the locket under the lamp in her room. There was an engraving on the back, EL 1937. The initials meant nothing to her, but the date raised questions. Who had the locket belonged to? And why had it been left for her to find? As Sarah pondered, a soft knock at her door startled her. She hadn't told anyone she was back. Cautiously, she approached and opened the door just a crack. Standing there was the same young woman she'd seen in the church earlier. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously up and down the hallway. "Let me in," she whispered urgently. Sarah hesitated but opened the door. The woman stepped inside, locking the door behind her. "You found the locket," she said, her voice trembling. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about that?" "Because it's mine," the woman replied, holding out her hand. Sarah hesitated again but handed over the locket. The woman clutched it tightly, tears welling in her eyes. "My name is Eleanor," she said. "And if you don't leave Ravenswood by dawn, you'll never leave at all." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, her expression pained. "This town, it's cursed. Everyone who stays too long becomes a part of it. Disappearances, deaths, they're not random. The town takes what it needs." "Needs?" Sarah pressed. "What does that mean?" Eleanor looked up, her eyes filled with both fear and resolve. "It's alive. The town itself. And it's been feeding for centuries." Sarah's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle still scattered and incomplete. "Why are you warning me? If you're part of this town, why do you care what happens to me?" Eleanor hesitated before answering. "Because I wasn't always part of it. I was like you once, an outsider. But I stayed too long. Now I'm trapped." The room seemed to grow colder as her words sank in. Sarah's instincts told her to run, to leave everything behind and escape before it was too late. But the journalist in her wouldn't allow it. "If you're trapped, how are you here warning me? Can't you just leave with me?" Eleanor shook her head. "I can only leave the shadows when the town allows it, and I can never cross its borders. You still have a chance. Go." But before Sarah could respond, a noise echoed through the inn, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Eleanor's face twisted in terror. "It knows I'm here," she whispered. The lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When they came back on, Eleanor was gone. The only trace of her was the locket, now lying on the bed. Sarah's breathing quickened. She grabbed her belongings and packed hurriedly. If what Eleanor had said was true, she couldn't afford to stay. But as she opened her door to leave, she found the hallway transformed. The walls were no longer covered in peeling wallpaper but seemed to pulse as if alive. A low, rhythmic sound filled the air, like a heartbeat. The exit at the end of the hallway seemed impossibly far, the shadows between her and it darker than they should have been. And then she heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. Sarah froze, her mind screaming at her to move, but her legs refused to obey. A shape emerged from the shadows, tall and faceless, its presence radiating malice. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah turned and ran, not down the hallway but toward the window. She flung it open and climbed onto the ledge, the cold night air biting at her skin. Without looking back, she jumped. The ground came up fast and the impact knocked the wind out of her. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself to stand. Behind her, the window slammed shut, the silhouette watching her from the glass. Sarah limped toward her car, her breaths ragged. As she fumbled with her keys, she felt the locket in her pocket. She didn't remember picking it up. When she looked back at the inn, every window was dark except one, the window of her room. And in that window, Eleanor stood, her face pressed against the glass, her expression unreadable. The engine roared to life, and Sarah sped away, her mind reeling. She had escaped the inn, but as the town sign came into view, she realized something horrifying. The sign no longer said, "Welcome to Ravenswood." It said, "You can't leave." Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The headlights cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the forest road ahead. But no matter how far she drove, the feeling of being watched persisted, a cold, crawling sensation that gnawed at her nerves. The words on the sign, "You can't leave," burned into her mind like a brand. The trees seemed to close in around her as if the forest itself was alive, conspiring to keep her in Ravenswood. The narrow road twisted and turned, each curve disorienting her further. The needle on her fuel gauge dipped dangerously close to empty, a cruel reminder that she hadn't prepared for an extended drive. "I just need to get to the highway," she muttered under her breath, her voice trembling. But deep down, a sinking dread told her it wasn't that simple. Her heart skipped a beat when the radio, which she hadn't turned on, crackled to life. Static filled the car, punctuated by faint, distorted whispers. She reached for the dial to turn it off, but before she could, a voice broke through the static, cold, hollow, and unmistakably familiar. "Sarah," it drawled, stretching her name like a taunt. She slammed her foot on the brake, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. The voice continued, low and mocking, as if it came from everywhere at once. "You think you can escape? You belong to us now." Her breath came in short gasps as she frantically scanned her surroundings. There was no one, no movement, no sign of another soul. The voice dissolved back into static, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Fighting the urge to abandon the car and run blindly into the woods, Sarah pressed the gas pedal and pushed forward. But after driving for what felt like an eternity, her headlights illuminated a chilling sight, the same sign she'd seen before. "Welcome to Ravenswood." Her pulse thundered in her ears. It wasn't possible. She hadn't turned around. She was certain of it. And yet, here she was, back at the edge of the cursed town. "No," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "No, no, no." Her frustration boiled over as she slammed her hands against the steering wheel. The car engine sputtered, and then, as if mocking her plight, it died completely. She turned the key in the ignition, but the car refused to start. Forced to face the inevitable, Sarah stepped out into the cold night air. The forest loomed around her, its shadows stretching unnaturally long under the moonlight. She pulled her coat tighter and grabbed her flashlight, the small beam offering little comfort. As she made her way back toward the town, a sense of wrongness settled over her. The road, the trees, even the air, it all felt different. The silence was no longer empty, it was charged, alive with an unseen presence. And then she heard it. Footsteps. They started faint, almost imperceptible, but grew louder with each passing second. They weren't hurried or frantic, but slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. Sarah spun around, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaky but defiant. No response. The footsteps stopped. Her flashlight caught movement, a figure standing just at the edge of the beam's reach. It was tall, impossibly thin, its outline distorted as if it didn't belong in this world. Sarah's grip on the flashlight tightened. "What do you want?" she called out, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. The figure tilted its head, an unnatural motion that sent a wave of nausea through her. Then it spoke, though its mouth didn't move. The words seemed to echo directly in her mind. "You can't leave, Sarah. You were chosen." The beam of her flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. The oppressive silence returned, but Sarah knew better than to believe she was alone. She turned and started walking again, her pace quickening with every step. As she neared the town's outskirts, a chilling realization struck her. The buildings, the streets, even the air, all of it felt different, as if Ravenswood itself had shifted. The town wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it was watching her. She stumbled back into the square, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The fountain, once a decrepit relic, now flowed with water that shimmered unnaturally under the moonlight. The locket in her pocket felt heavier, almost as if it were pulsing in sync with her racing heart. The sound of a child's laughter echoed through the square, high-pitched and unnerving. Sarah spun around, her flashlight cutting through the shadows, but there was no one there. The laughter grew louder, more distorted, until it became a cacophony of voices, men, women, children, all speaking at once. "Why did you come? You shouldn't have stayed. It's too late now." The voices overlapped, rising to a deafening crescendo. Sarah clapped her hands over her ears, sinking to her knees. "Stop!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was no longer in the square. She was standing in a dark, narrow hallway. The walls were made of rough stone, damp with moisture that dripped steadily onto the floor. The air was thick and cold, making each breath a struggle. She turned, trying to orient herself, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The locket, now glowing faintly, seemed to pull her forward, guiding her deeper into the unknown. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally as she followed the pull of the locket. The hallway twisted and turned, leading her to a heavy wooden door. Symbols were carved into its surface, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as she looked at them. Summoning every ounce of courage, Sarah pushed the door open. Inside was a cavernous room, its walls lined with shelves filled with dusty, leather-bound books and jars containing unidentifiable substances. At the center of the room was a massive stone table, and on it lay a map of Ravenswood. But it wasn't just a map. Moved. The streets pulsed like veins, the buildings shifting like living organisms. Sarah approached cautiously, her eyes drawn to a single glowing point on the map, the inn where she'd been staying. As she stared, a voice filled the room. It wasn't the cold, mocking voice she'd heard before. This one was deeper, older, and filled with a malevolent authority. "You've come far, Sarah," it rumbled. "But the game has only begun." The door slammed shut behind her. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest as the ancient voice reverberated through the room. The heavy wooden door that had slammed shut seemed to disappear into the stone wall, leaving her trapped. The dim light in the cavern flickered, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. She turned back to the pulsing map on the table, the glowing dot marking the inn burning into her vision. The veins running through the map, streets, alleyways, and paths, seemed to writhe, almost alive, shifting subtly each time she blinked. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice breaking as she faced the empty room. The voice answered, low and deliberate, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What does any predator want, Sarah? To feed." The word hung in the air, chilling in its simplicity. Sarah backed away from the table, her legs trembling. "I'm not part of this. I didn't ask for this." The voice chuckled, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers racing down her spine. You were chosen long before you ever set foot in Ravenswood. Do you think it was coincidence that brought you here? That you survived the warnings? I'll leave, she yelled, desperation lacing her words. I'll never come back. You cannot leave, the voice hissed, and the walls seemed to close in as it spoke. Not until you fulfill your purpose. Sarah clenched her fists, the locket still glowing faintly in her palm. She glanced at the shelves lining the room, hoping for a clue, a weapon, anything to help her escape. Her eyes landed on a thick ancient book bound in cracked leather. Strange symbols were etched into its cover, and as she reached for it, the voice growled in disapproval. Do not touch what you cannot comprehend. Ignoring the warning, Sarah yanked the book from the shelf and opened it. The pages were filled with illegible scrawls and dark, ominous illustrations. One image caught her eye, a figure standing before a map that looked exactly like the one on the table. The figure was holding something aloft, a locket identical to the one she now possessed. The realization struck her like a lightning bolt. The locket wasn't just a trinket, it was a key. What is this? She demanded, holding up the book. What does it mean? The voice didn't answer. Instead, the room grew colder, and the faint hum of whispers began to fill the air. They came from the walls, the ceiling, even the floor, 1,000 overlapping voices speaking in languages Sarah couldn't understand. Suddenly, the map on the table flared with light, the glowing dot expanding into a small, three-dimensional projection of Ravenswood. Sarah watched in stunned silence as tiny figures appeared on the streets, people moving through the town. She recognized them, the innkeeper, the butcher, the priest. They all looked normal at first glance, but their movements were jerky, almost puppet-like, as if they were being controlled. What are they? Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. They are what remains, the voice replied. Echoes of the lives they once lived, bound to the town, serving its will. Sarah's stomach churned. And me? Am I supposed to become one of them? You are more, the voice answered cryptically. You are the one who will bring the offering. The word offering sent a wave of nausea through her. What offering? To what? The voice didn't respond. Instead, the room began to tremble, dust falling from the ceiling as the walls seemed to pulse. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single, deafening roar. Sarah clutched the locket tightly, instinctively holding it out like a shield. The glowing intensified, and the roaring stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. The table split down the middle with a loud crack, revealing a dark, spiraling staircase descending into the earth. A faint, unnatural light emanated from the depths, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. No, Sarah whispered, shaking her head. I'm not going down there. But the pull of the locket was undeniable. It grew warmer in her hand, almost burning, as if urging her forward. Your fate awaits below, the voice rumbled. Do not delay. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but where could she go? The door was gone, and the walls seemed alive, watching her every move. Summoning all her courage, Sarah stepped onto the staircase. The air grew colder with each step, the darkness pressing in around her. The faint light below provided little comfort, casting eerie, shifting patterns on the walls. The whispers returned, softer now, as if beckoning her closer. The staircase ended in a massive cavern, its walls lined with jagged crystals that pulsed with a sickly green light. At the center of the cavern was a stone altar, and on it lay a figure. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was Eleanor. The young woman's face was pale, her body unnaturally still. Her chest rose and fell shallowly as if she were in a deep sleep or a trance. The locket in Sarah's hand grew impossibly hot, and she dropped it with a gasp. It clattered onto the stone floor, its glow intensifying until it illuminated the entire cavern. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. You shouldn't have come, she said, her voice distant and hollow. I'm trying to leave, Sarah replied, her voice shaking. But every path leads back here. Eleanor sat up slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural. Because there is no leaving. Not for you. Not for any of us. What does it want from me? Sarah asked, her desperation mounting. Eleanor's expression softened, and for a brief moment she looked like the terrified young woman Sarah had met before. It wants what it always wants, she said softly. Blood. Sacrifice. Sarah backed away, her heart pounding. No, I'm not going to. Her words were cut off by a deafening roar. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and a massive shadow rose from the darkness beyond the altar. It had no defined shape, shifting constantly like a living nightmare. Its eyes, if they could be called that, burned with an unnatural light, and its presence filled the cavern with an overwhelming sense of dread. Eleanor turned to face the entity, her expression resigned. "It's too late," she whispered. "You've already been chosen." The entity moved closer, its shadow enveloping the altar and Sarah along with it. She tried to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. The last thing she saw was the locket, its glow swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The darkness consumed Sarah, suffocating her in its cold embrace. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the void around her. Her limbs felt like they were being dragged under, her body unable to move as if trapped in a nightmare where escape was an illusion. The presence looming over her felt suffocating, its cold, pulsating energy pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She could feel the shadows wrapping around her, pulling her closer to something. A fate, a consequence she didn't fully understand. Her heart pounded in her ears, every beat like a countdown to something inevitable. And then, just as quickly as the pressure had come, it disappeared. The world snapped back into focus, and Sarah found herself lying on the cold, stone floor of the cavern. She gasped for air, her lungs burning as if she had been holding her breath for eternity. The shadows, the presence, the terrifying feeling of being trapped, it was all gone. But something had changed. She stood up slowly, her body shaking from the aftereffects of whatever force had just taken hold of her. Her eyes scanned the cavern, but there was no sign of the entity or the altar. Everything around her felt wrong. The air was thick with an oppressive heaviness, and the faint glow of the crystals cast distorted shadows on the walls. The locket. Sarah looked down and saw it at her feet. It had stopped glowing, its once bright light now a dull, lifeless shimmer. She hesitated for a moment, but the compulsion to pick it up was undeniable. As her fingers closed around it, a strange chill ran up her spine, and the whispers that had been silent for so long began again. Quiet at first, then louder, growing into a cacophony of voices indistinguishable from one another. "Sarah, come back, you belong here." The voices twisted in her mind, echoing with a maddening certainty. "No," Sarah whispered through clenched teeth, backing away from the voices. "I don't belong here." She turned and ran, not knowing where she was going, only knowing that she had to escape this place, had to get away from the pull of the locket, the town, the darkness that seemed to consume everything. But no matter how fast she ran, it felt as though the cavern stretched on forever, the walls closing in around her. The ground beneath her feet shifted, like the very earth was moving to trap her. She stumbled, falling to the ground, the locket slipping from her grasp as she scrambled to regain her footing. When she looked up, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The stone altar had returned, and on it Eleanor lay once more. Her body was now pale and lifeless, her eyes open but empty, staring at nothing. The once bright spark of life was gone from her face, replaced with a hollow, glassy stare. She looked wrong. The whispers grew louder, urging Sarah to approach, to accept her fate. "She is part of it now," they hissed. "You will be too." Sarah forced herself to her feet, her chest tight with fear. No, this isn't real, none of this is real." But as she spoke, the cavern seemed to twist around her, and Eleanor's body began to move. Slowly, her stiff form rose from the altar, as if guided by invisible hands. Her limbs jerked unnaturally, her neck snapping as her head tilted at an impossible angle. The sound of bones cracking echoed throughout the cavern, sending a wave of nausea through Sarah. Eleanor's eyes locked onto Sarah's, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition. But then her lips curled into a twisted, unnatural smile. "Join us," Eleanor's voice rasped, no longer sounding human. It was hollow, echoing with the voices of the town's lost souls. "It's too late to escape. You are one of us now." The ground trembled beneath Sarah's feet, and from the shadows, other figures began to emerge, twisted, deformed shapes that seemed to be made of the very darkness itself. They moved toward her with unnatural speed, their eyes glowing like fiery embers in the pitch-black cavern. Sarah's heart raced. Panic surged through her veins as she turned to run again, her legs heavy and uncooperative. Every step felt like wading through thick, oppressive air. The figures behind her were getting closer. She could hear their footsteps, the scraping of something sharp on stone, the whispering calling her name. She reached for the locket, clutching it in her trembling hands. There had to be something she could do, something to stop them, to stop this nightmare from becoming her reality. But the locket only burned hotter, its glow intensifying with every second. Then a voice, not the hollow whispers but a voice that sounded like her own, spoke within her mind. "You are the offering." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her mind reeled, but everything around her seemed to slow, as if time itself were bending. The cavern seemed to stretch, the walls closing in on her once again, but this time she could feel it. They were here for her. The town had always been waiting for her. Without thinking, she spun around, her eyes locking onto Eleanor, whose twisted smile only grew wider. The figures were closing in, their forms now surrounding Sarah, blocking any path of escape. The voice in her mind echoed once more. "Sacrifice yourself to them." Sarah's body froze, the weight of the realization crashing down on her. The offering, it had to be her. She took a step forward, then another, each one harder than the last, as if the weight of what she was about to do was too much for her to bear. The locket was hot in her hand, as though urging her onward, drawing her closer to the inevitable conclusion. Eleanor's figure stepped forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. "You are the one we've been waiting for," she said, her voice low, almost a hiss. "Don't fight it. We are all one now." Sarah's vision blurred with tears, but she continued forward, each step like a hammer striking her heart. The cavern seemed to pulse with energy, the walls vibrating as if reacting to her presence. The figures surrounding her reached out, their hands twisted, deformed, no longer human. They were the lost souls of Ravenswood, trapped in this twisted place, waiting for the next to join them. With one final, shuddering breath, Sarah closed her eyes and placed the locket over her heart. Everything went black. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the very air had been stolen from the cavern. Sarah's body trembled, but not from fear. It was as though every cell within her had been paralyzed, frozen in place by some unseen force. Her mind screamed, but her body refused to respond, her arms and legs locked in place. A strange warmth spread through her, starting from the locket that still pressed against her chest. The heat intensified, making her skin feel as though it were about to scorch. Yet there was no pain. Just an overwhelming, suffocating sense of wrongness that seemed to seep into her very soul. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. No voices, no shadows. Just a cold, void-like emptiness that made her feel both weightless and suffocated. And then, slowly, she became aware of something. A sensation like a pulse reverberated through the cavern. It was distant at first, like the faintest echo of a heartbeat. But it grew louder, stronger, until it felt as if the very earth was vibrating with it. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and she could feel the locket pressing harder against her chest, almost as if it were alive. Then the voices returned, louder and more distinct than before. The whispers had become screams, a cacophony of desperate, hollow calls that clawed at her mind. They surrounded her, rushing in from all directions, overwhelming her senses. She tried to scream, but no sound came. She wanted to run, but her body remained immobile, a prisoner of some unseen force. But amidst the chaos of voices, one voice stood out. It was a familiar voice, a voice she had heard before. "Sarah?" She forced her eyes open, blinking against the oppressive darkness. Through the heavy, swirling shadows, she saw a figure standing before her, Eleanor. But this wasn't the same twisted version of Eleanor she had seen before. This was her, alive, full of life. But something was wrong. Eleanor's face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, but her lips were curled into a smile that was far too wide. Her eyes glinted with a strange, almost predatory gleam as she took a step closer. "You should have known better," Eleanor said, her voice no longer the soft, fearful tone Sarah remembered. It was sharp like a blade cutting through the thick air. "This town has never let anyone leave." "Not really. And you, Sarah, have been marked. Chosen." "Marked?" Sarah managed to choke out, her voice weak as if she were speaking from the depths of a nightmare. Eleanor's smile widened and she tilted her head, her gaze never leaving Sarah's. "You've always been a part of this. All along." Her voice was cold now, cruel. "From the moment you arrived in Ravenswood, you were already a part of its story. The town doesn't let go once it has its sights on you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She could feel her pulse quicken, her mind racing. "No, this isn't possible. I'm not, this can't be." "It's already done," Eleanor interrupted, her voice dark with finality. You didn't choose this, but you were always meant to be here. This town claims what it wants, and when it wants something, there is no escaping it. The locket was just the first step. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled against the invisible chains that seemed to hold her in place. No, she had to get out. She had to escape. This couldn't be happening. But Eleanor continued, her eyes dark and knowing. The locket binds you to this place. It's more than just a key, it's a pact. A covenant, if you will. You've already made the sacrifice, Sarah. Now there is no turning back. Sarah's mind reeled. Sacrifice? What had she sacrificed? She couldn't remember making any kind of deal, of offering anything. Only the cold, suffocating darkness, the overwhelming presence of the entity, the whispers, and now Eleanor's strange, mocking words. The weight of what she was hearing felt unreal, but deep down she knew it wasn't a lie. The locket at her chest grew unbearably hot, and Sarah's entire body went rigid with the intensity of the heat. It felt as if her very soul were being pulled toward it, toward the place that had called her here. It was as if the locket, the entity, and the town were one and the same, and now they were claiming their prize. No? Sarah gasped, trying to tear herself away from the force that was drawing her in. But it was useless. Her limbs were locked in place, unable to move, as if the world around her had ceased to acknowledge her struggle. Eleanor's laughter rang through the cavern, an eerie, high-pitched sound that sent a cold shiver down Sarah's spine. You really think you have control? That you can just walk away from this? The town has always had a purpose for you. You've always been part of it. The offering, the sacrifice, was never yours to make. It was already decided long before you arrived. What are you talking about? Sarah's voice trembled, barely a whisper, as she looked at Eleanor, the woman she once thought of as a friend. Eleanor's eyes darkened further, her smile twisting into something that was no longer human. The bloodline. It runs through you, Sarah. Your family, the real reason you came to Ravenswood. You weren't just brought here by chance. You were brought here because you belong. Your family has always been a part of this town. The curse, the blood. It's been passed down for generations. Sarah's pulse raced, her mind reeling with the implications of Eleanor's words. My family? What do you mean? Eleanor stepped closer, her presence now overwhelming. They were the first, the ones who made the deal, the ones who gave the town its power. And now it's your turn to fulfill that bargain. You were always meant to be the final piece. Her lips parted, and in a voice that no longer resembled the woman Sarah had once known, she said, "The offering is you." Sarah's world spun out of control. The weight of Eleanor's words crushed her, and all at once she could see it. The truth behind the town, the locket, the sacrifices that had been made, and the price that had been paid. The voices, the lost souls, the ones who had been consumed by the town, they weren't just trapped here. They were waiting for her. Her breath caught in her throat, and she could feel the cold touch of inevitability creeping over her, the darkness pulling her closer, whispering in her ear. The locket, the cursed ancient thing, had never been just an object. It was a chain, a binding contract. The town of Ravenswood had chosen her long before she ever set foot on its cursed streets. And now there was no escape. Her knees buckled beneath her, the weight of what she was about to face too much to bear. She had no choice anymore. No escape. Her bloodline had already sealed her fate. You belong here, Eleanor's voice echoed as she reached out to touch Sarah's shoulder. The darkness closed in, and Sarah felt herself sinking, falling into the abyss, into the very heart of the curse that had haunted this place for centuries. And then everything went black. When Sarah opened her eyes, it wasn't the cavern she expected. It wasn't Ravenswood or any place she recognized. Instead, she found herself in a place that seemed both familiar and foreign, a distorted reflection of the world she knew. The air was thick with fog, swirling around her like ghostly tendrils. The ground was soft beneath her feet as if she were walking on clouds, but it felt wrong, heavy, like gravity was pulling her down harder than it should. She tried to move, but her body was stiff, as if bound by invisible chains. The weight of the locket still burned against her chest, a constant reminder of her fate. But when she looked down, it was no longer the same locket she had seen before. It had changed. The once silver surface had darkened, and intricate, twisted markings now covered its surface, glowing faintly with a red light. It looked as though it was alive, its pulse syncing with the rhythm of her own heart. What is happening? She could hear a low humming in the distance, like a distant chant or a song. It felt like it was calling her, beckoning her forward, deeper into this strange, shifting place. Every step she took seemed to ripple through the fog, disturbing its stillness for only a brief moment before it settled again. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing with questions. What was this place? Was it real? Was she dreaming? But deep inside her, she knew the truth. There was no dream. This place was just as real as the town of Ravenswood, just as real as the cursed locket. The air tasted of something ancient, something unyielding, as if this place had existed before time itself began to count the days. As she took another step, the fog parted, revealing a figure standing before her. She froze. The figure was familiar, too familiar. It was Eleanor, but not the Eleanor she had seen just moments ago. This was a different version, a darker version, standing tall and proud, her eyes glowing with an unsettling intensity. There was no warmth in her smile now, no sign of the woman Sarah had once known. Instead, it was a predator's grin, filled with something ancient and cruel. "You're finally here," Eleanor said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a booming, thunderous echo that seemed to resonate through the very fabric of this place. "I knew you would come. You always were destined to be part of this." The final piece in the ritual. Sarah's chest tightened, a wave of dread flooding her senses. "What is this place?" Her voice barely broke through the suffocating silence, trembling with the weight of the truth that was closing in on her. "What do you want from me?" Eleanor's smile stretched wider, her eyes glowing brighter. "This is the place where it all began. The heart of Ravenswood's curse. The town, it's not just a place, Sarah. It's a living, breathing entity. It feeds on souls, feeds on the lost, the broken. And you? You were always meant to be a part of it. Your family, your bloodline, are the final key to its power." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. The ground beneath her feet trembled, as though the earth itself was reacting to Eleanor's words. The final key. The final piece in a puzzle that stretched back generations, consuming every person that had ever lived in Ravenswood. She was the last in line. The last one to give herself up. She was the offering. "No," Sarah gasped, stepping backward. "I won't be a part of this. You can't make me." Her voice wavered, but she stood her ground. "I didn't ask for this. You can't just—" "You've already made your choice," Eleanor interrupted, her voice cold, devoid of emotion. "You've always made your choice. From the moment you set foot in Ravenswood, from the moment the locket chose you, you sealed your fate. You belong to the town now, Sarah. And the town, it has waited so long for you." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Her breathing quickened as the weight of Eleanor's words settled over her. She felt the locket burning hotter against her skin, as though it were feeding off her fear, growing stronger with each passing second. It was all true. All of it. The curse, the whispers, the bloodline. It had never been a matter of choice. She had always been part of this twisted fate, part of the story that had started long before she was born. But there had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break this. She couldn't give in. "No," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. "I won't do this. I won't let this town claim me too." Eleanor's expression didn't falter. "It's not up to you, Sarah. It was never up to you." She raised her hand, and the fog seemed to churn and twist around them as if responding to her command. The very air began to vibrate, the ground cracking beneath Sarah's feet. "You see," Eleanor continued, her tone now dangerously calm, "this curse, it has a will of its own. And it has already claimed so many before you. The town doesn't give up its chosen. It doesn't let go. Not until it has taken everything." She took a step forward, and the fog parted once more, revealing a darkened figure standing in the distance, hidden in the shadows. It was them, the lost souls. The figures stepped forward, their forms twisted and deformed, faces contorted in agonizing expressions. They were the forgotten, the broken ones who had come before her, those who had been consumed by Ravenswood, their souls trapped here for eternity. Their eyes glowed with a hollow hunger, a darkness that stretched beyond time. They reached out toward Sarah with skeletal hands, their fingers scraping against the air, desperate for release. "This is what awaits you," Eleanor said softly, almost pityingly. "This is the fate of all who are chosen by Ravenswood. You will join them. You will become one of us." "No," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the soul's whispers. She stumbled backward, but the ground seemed to shift beneath her, pulling her closer to the gathering figures. The fog thickened, blinding her as the temperature dropped, the chill seeping into her bones. The locket was burning now, the heat unbearable, and Sarah could feel it drawing her in, tugging her toward the waiting darkness. The souls were getting closer, their twisted forms closing in on her with every passing moment. Their whispers were a constant buzz in her ears, their voices pleading, begging her to join them, to become one with them. "No," Sarah choked out again, but this time her voice was stronger. "I won't join you. I won't give in. I'm not like you." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, and the smile faded from her face. "You don't understand, do you? You've already made your choice. You are already one of us. You just don't know it yet." The fog swirled around Sarah, growing thicker, denser, until it was impossible to see anything but shadows. The figures of the lost souls were closing in, their hands reaching out for her, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. And then, as if the very air had been sucked from the world, there was a crack. A deafening, bone-chilling sound that rang through the fog. The ground beneath Sarah's feet shifted again, but this time it was different. She was falling. Falling into the darkness, into the void that had been waiting for her all along. She reached out, her fingers grasping at the air, but there was nothing to hold on to. The darkness consumed her, swallowing her whole. And then, everything went silent. When Sarah awoke, it wasn't in the dark, suffocating fog of the unknown. It wasn't the haunted town of Ravenswood, nor the cold, empty abyss where the lost souls waited for their next victim. Instead, she found herself lying on the grass, the coolness of the earth beneath her like a soft cushion, as if she had just been placed there after a long and endless fall. The air was crisp, the sky a deep shade of violet, with stars twinkling above her like distant, cold eyes. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. The weight of the locket was gone. The oppressive heat that had once burned against her chest was no more. There was no more fog, no more shadows. She sat up slowly, scanning her surroundings. She was alone in a field under a sky that seemed impossibly vast. The wind whispered through the trees in the distance, but it was a peaceful sound, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed her for so long. Had it all been a dream? But as she looked down at her hands, she saw them, the marks. They were faint but unmistakable. Dark, jagged lines that ran up her arms, like the remnants of some ancient ritual. And the locket, it was still gone. She felt a sharp pang of loss, as if something vital had been ripped from her, but at the same time, the absence of its weight felt almost like a relief. It was over. She stood, her legs weak beneath her, and tried to steady herself. The world around her was so different, so quiet. No voices whispered from the shadows. No ancient force pulled at her soul. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. But just as she began to believe that she had escaped, that the curse was finally behind her, something shifted in the air. The temperature dropped, the wind picking up suddenly as if a storm were approaching. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, and a distant, unnatural hum filled the space around her. She turned, her heart hammering in her chest. And there, standing at the edge of the field, was Eleanor. But this wasn't the Eleanor she had seen before, the one with the twisted smile. No, this Eleanor was different. Her eyes were still glowing with that same dark energy, but her face was calm, almost serene. Her expression was no longer one of cruelty. It was one of understanding. "You're free, Sarah," Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the field in a way that felt too loud, too powerful for such a peaceful setting. "But freedom comes at a cost." Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but her body remained still. "What do you mean?" "I'm free. I'm out of Ravenswood. I'm not a part of this anymore." Eleanor took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "You were always meant to be the final piece. You still are." Sarah shook her head, the panic rising in her chest. "No, I'm not. It's over. It's done." Eleanor smiled, but it was a sad, almost pitying smile. "You don't understand, do you? The town, the curse, it doesn't end. It's never truly over. You can't break free, Sarah. None of us can. We are part of something bigger than ourselves. The town's hunger, it's eternal, and it claims what it wants in the end." Sarah's pulse quickened as the weight of Eleanor's words settled over her like a crushing wave. No, she had fought so hard. She had fought through the darkness, the shadows, the souls calling for her to join them. She had resisted. She had broken free. But this was different. "You can't take me back," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "I won't go back. I won't." Eleanor's eyes flashed with something darker now, something that felt colder than the night itself. It's not about what you want, Sarah. It's about what you were born into. You don't get to escape. None of us do. The ground beneath Sarah's feet began to crack again, the earth trembling in response to the forces that seemed to be awakening. The sky shifted, the stars flickering in and out, as if the very fabric of reality was coming undone. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The wind fell silent. The earth ceased its trembling. The hum disappeared. Sarah blinked, trying to comprehend what was happening. But when she looked back at Eleanor, she was gone. Vanished into thin air as if she had never been there at all. The field around her was still. The night had returned to its peaceful silence. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, unsure if the confrontation had been real or just another part of the nightmare. But the marks on her arms remained. The scar of the curse that had bound her to Ravenswood was still there, but now it was a part of her. It wasn't something she could escape. It wasn't something she could fight. She was marked. The silence was deafening. But in that silence, Sarah understood the truth. She hadn't escaped. Ravenswood had never let go. It had only waited. The locket was gone, but the darkness it had summoned had already been woven into her soul. The curse was no longer bound by the town, by the fog, or by the twisted figure of Eleanor. It was within her now, a part of who she was. And as she stood in the cold night, the eerie stillness surrounding her, she felt it, a presence watching her from just beyond the shadows. The eyes of the lost souls. They weren't gone. They were waiting, just like she had always been. The hunger of Ravenswood would never be sated. And now, Sarah was one of its own. Story 3. It started with the sound of her own name, whispered in the kind of voice that feels like it's coming from inside your head. Amelia had been awake, staring at the ceiling in the silence of her apartment when she heard it, soft, low, and unmistakably real. She sat up, her heart racing, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't just her name. The voice carried something else, something chilling, as if whoever was speaking already knew she was listening. Midnight. Come alone. She froze. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't her imagination. She knew that in her bones. But when she scanned the empty room, there was nothing there, just the faint hum of the city outside her window. By morning, she convinced herself it was a dream. But then the letter arrived. A plain envelope slipped under her door, sealed with a wax mark, a jagged circle broken into halves. Inside was a single sentence. The manor has waited long enough. She didn't tell anyone about the voice or the letter. Who would believe her? She barely believed it herself. But as the hours dragged on, she felt it, the pressure building in her chest, the inexplicable pull towards something she didn't understand. By nightfall, she found herself standing outside her apartment with no idea how she'd gotten there, clutching the letter in one hand, her car keys in the other. It was as if her body moved on its own, driving her to the edge of town where the streetlights faded and the air grew heavy. The manor sat shrouded in darkness at the end of a dirt road, its silhouette looming against the cloudy sky. She hadn't been here before, but somehow it felt familiar, as if the house had been waiting for her. The gate screeched open without resistance, and she stepped onto the gravel path leading to the entrance. Each step felt heavier than the last, her breath fogging in the cold air. The door to the house creaked as she pushed it open, revealing an entryway that seemed untouched by time. She hesitated in the doorway, the silence almost deafening. Then, faintly from somewhere deep inside, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly far apart. She should have run. She should have turned around, slammed the door, and driven as fast as she could back to the life she knew. But something kept her rooted in place. Amelia? It wasn't the same voice from before. This one was deeper, almost like a growl, and it came from the darkness ahead. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up. She walked further into the house, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The hallway stretched endlessly, and the farther she went, the less sense it made. Doors that should have led to other rooms opened into empty voids or places that didn't match the layout of the house. One door drew her in. It was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out from the gap. She pushed it open, revealing a room that felt like it didn't belong in this century. The walls were lined with shelves of old books, the air thick with the smell of aged paper and something metallic. At the center of the room stood a table, and on it lay an object she recognized instantly, her childhood diary. It wasn't possible. She had lost it years ago during a move. Yet here it was, the same worn leather cover, the same faded ink. She reached for it with trembling hands, flipping it open to a random page. The handwriting was hers, but the words weren't. Amelia, you've been here before. Do you remember? She slammed the book shut, her breathing ragged. The shadows in the room shifted, the light flickering as if the walls themselves were breathing. Who's there? She shouted, her voice cracking. The only answer was laughter, soft at first, then louder, echoing all around her. She backed toward the door, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she turned to run, the floor gave way beneath her and she plunged into darkness. Amelia's scream was swallowed by the void before she even realized she was falling. The sensation wasn't like falling down a hole. It was as if the air itself pulled her downward, gripping her with an invisible force. When she finally hit solid ground, the impact was softer than she expected, though it still knocked the wind out of her. She opened her eyes to find herself in a room that wasn't the one she had just left. It was dark, save for a dim light flickering from a single bulb hanging from a frayed cord above her. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, streaked with something dark and wet. The diary was gone. She pushed herself up slowly, her hands trembling. The air was heavy here, suffocating, and carried a faint metallic tang. As she stood, she realized the room wasn't empty. In the far corner, something moved. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the shadows. Then she saw it clearly, a figure crouched low, its limbs long and twisted unnaturally. It wasn't looking at her, but she knew it was aware of her. Its head tilted in short, jerky motions as if sniffing the air. Amelia froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to stay silent, to not move a muscle. The figure let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl mixed with a clicking noise. Slowly, it began to crawl toward her, its movements uneven but deliberate. She took a step back, her heel brushing against something on the floor. A loose board creaked beneath her weight, and the figure's head snapped toward her. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed faintly like embers in the dark. Amelia didn't wait to see what it would do. She turned and ran, bolting through the nearest door. The hallway she found herself in was unlike anything she'd ever seen. It was impossibly long, stretching into the distance without end. Doors lined both sides, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms that didn't make sense. Rooms filled with objects from her past, rooms that seemed to be from other eras, and some that looked like they belonged to other worlds entirely. She didn't dare stop. The sound of the creature's uneven crawl echoed behind her, growing louder. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she reached a door at the very end of the hallway. Unlike the others, it was closed, and the doorknob was cold and slick under her hand. She twisted it desperately, throwing her weight against the door until it burst open. Inside was a circular room, its walls covered in mirrors. But the reflections didn't make sense. She saw herself in some of them, but not as she was now. In one, she was a child, clutching her lost diary. In another, she was older, her face gaunt and hollow, her eyes filled with fear. And in yet another, she wasn't alone. A shadow stood behind her, its twisted limbs wrapped around her shoulders like a lover's embrace. The door slammed shut behind her, and the room seemed to shift. The floor beneath her feet became uneven, and the mirrors began to ripple as if they were made of water. From the mirror directly in front of her, her reflection spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Amelia staggered back, her mind reeling. The reflection didn't mimic her movements. It stayed perfectly still, its eyes locked on hers. What is this place?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it reached out, pressing its hand against the surface of the mirror. The glass began to crack, spiderwebbing outward until it shattered completely. But instead of falling, the shards floated in the air, spinning around her like a whirlwind. Each shard reflected something different. Moments from her life, fragments of memories she had buried or forgotten. And then she heard the voice again. "Amelia, the manor has waited long enough." The shards stopped spinning, freezing in midair before they began to reassemble themselves. But this time they didn't form a mirror. They formed a door. She didn't want to go through it. Every fiber of her being screamed that whatever lay beyond was worse than what she had already faced. But the room offered no other escape. The sound of the creature from the hallway grew louder, and she realized it was at the door. With no other choice, she stepped through the fragmented door. The world on the other side wasn't a world at all. Was nothing. Or at least it seemed like nothing at first. Amelia stumbled forward, expecting solid ground, but the floor beneath her feet was soft and cold, like walking on a dense fog. The air was silent, oppressively so, until it wasn't. A low hum started, distant and faint, but it grew louder with every breath she took. Then the light changed. At first, she thought it was her eyes adjusting, but no, it was the horizon itself, a dim, shifting glow that revealed the vast emptiness stretching out before her. The floor she stood on wasn't solid at all. It shimmered, reflecting a distorted version of herself as if she were walking on liquid glass. Amelia's breathing quickened as she turned to look behind her. The door she had entered through was gone. The creature's pursuit had stopped, but the silence left something worse, the sense that she wasn't alone. She took a cautious step forward, her footsteps causing faint ripples in the glassy surface beneath her. The hum grew louder. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then she heard it again, her name. Amelia. The voice was familiar, but not comforting. It was her own voice, distorted and hollow, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. She spun around, searching for the source, but there was only the endless expanse of glass and light. Her reflection rippled below her, distorted and fragmented like the surface was a broken mirror. But something caught her eye. One of the reflections moved out of sync with her. She froze, staring down at the distorted version of herself. Slowly, the reflection lifted its head and smiled. Not a human smile, but something stretched and wrong, a mockery of an expression. Her distorted reflection mouthed a word, but no sound came. Help. Amelia staggered back, her foot catching on the surface and sending her tumbling to her knees. The reflection disappeared, but the glass began to crack beneath her, tiny fractures spreading outward in intricate, web-like patterns. She scrambled to her feet as the hum turned into a deafening roar. Then the cracks gave way. The floor shattered, and she plummeted into the dark again. This time the landing was harder. She hit solid ground, the impact jarring her bones. Groaning, she pushed herself up, blinking against the dim light that surrounded her. The place she found herself in now was far different. It was a narrow hallway, lined with walls of blackened stone. The air was cold and damp, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed somewhere far off. At the end of the hallway was a door. Unlike the others she had seen, this one was covered in intricate carvings, symbols and shapes that seemed to writhe and shift when she tried to focus on them. She didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to find another way, but there was no other way. As she approached the door, the carvings seemed to react to her presence. The shapes twisted and coiled, forming patterns that almost looked like faces that screamed silently as her hand reached for the handle. The moment she touched it, the door swung open on its own. Beyond was a room bathed in flickering candlelight. It was circular, with walls covered in the same symbols as the door. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it lay the diary. Her breath caught in her throat. The book was open, the pages filled with words she couldn't read, written in an ink that shimmered and moved like liquid. As she stepped closer, the candles around her flared, their flames rising unnaturally high. And then she heard it, a voice that wasn't her own, deep and resonant, echoing in the confined space. "You've come far, Amelia, but you've only just begun." She turned sharply, her eyes darting around the room. No one was there. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, the diary's pages began to flip on their own, faster and faster until they stopped abruptly. The words on the page seemed to rise off the paper, swirling in the air before forming a single phrase in front of her. "Do you remember what you did?" Amelia's blood ran cold. What I did? The room grew darker, the candlelight dimming as shadows crept closer. The voice spoke again, quieter this time, almost like a whisper in her ear. "You've been here before. You asked for this. Don't you remember?" Images flashed through her mind, fragments of memories she didn't recognize. Her younger self standing outside the manor, holding the diary. A conversation with someone whose face was obscured by shadow. Promises made. Warnings ignored. "No," she said aloud, shaking her head. "I don't remember any of this." The shadows seemed to laugh, a low, guttural sound that made her stomach churn. "You will," the voice said. Suddenly, the room tilted, and Amelia was thrown off balance. The symbols on the walls began to glow, their light pulsating in time with the now deafening hum. The diary snapped shut and the room was swallowed in darkness. When the light returned, she was no longer in the room. She was back in the hallway, but it wasn't empty anymore. Figures lined the walls, their faces obscured, their bodies wrapped in shadows that shifted like smoke. They all turned to face her. The figures along the hallway remained motionless, their shadowy forms flickering like candle flames in a windless room. Amelia felt their attention. Though they had no discernible eyes, she knew they were watching her. Her chest tightened as the air seemed to thicken, making every breath a labor. She couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. One of the figures stepped forward. It didn't walk, it glided, its feet never touching the floor. As it approached, its shape became clearer, though not any less terrifying. Its face was blank, a smooth void where features should have been. It stopped a few feet from her, its head tilting slightly as if it were studying her. Then it spoke. "You've forgotten," it said, its voice a hollow, echoing rasp. "But that doesn't absolve you." Amelia tried to speak, but her mouth was dry, her throat constricted with fear. What do you mean?" she managed to croak out. The figure didn't answer directly. Instead, it raised a hand, if it could be called that. Its arm stretched unnaturally, the shadowy limb twisting and elongating as it pointed toward the end of the hallway. "Go," it said. "You'll understand." Amelia didn't want to move. Every fiber of her being screamed that whatever lay at the end of the hallway would destroy her. But the weight of the figure's presence left her no choice. Her feet began to move, slow and unsteady at first, then faster as the pull grew stronger. The other figures lining the walls watched silently, their heads turning to follow her movements. The hallway seemed endless, stretching farther with each step. The light dimmed and the air grew colder, but she kept going, drawn by something she couldn't explain. Eventually she reached a door. Unlike the others she had seen, this one was ordinary, wooden, with a simple brass handle. It looked worn, as if it had been opened and closed countless times. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She could feel the energy radiating from it, a low vibration that sent shivers through her body. Amelia closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. What she saw on the other side made her heart stop. It was her. Not a reflection, not a distorted version, but her, standing in the middle of the room. The other Amelia looked exactly the same. Same clothes, same expression, even the same scratches on her arms from when she'd fallen earlier. The other Amelia turned to face her, a small, sad smile on her lips. "You're finally here," the doppelganger said, her voice identical to Amelia's. Amelia's mouth went dry. What is this? Who are you?" "I'm you," the other Amelia said simply. "Or at least, the part of you that you've tried so hard to forget." Amelia shook her head, backing away. "No, this isn't real. This can't be real." The other Amelia tilted her head. "Isn't it? You came here, didn't you? You heard the voice. You saw the diary. You knew this place was waiting for you." Amelia's mind raced, fragments of memories flickering in and out like static on an old TV. She remembered the diary, the promises, the warnings, but they felt like someone else's memories, like dreams she'd long since forgotten. "I don't understand," she whispered. The other Amelia stepped closer, her expression softening. "You will," she said. "But you won't like what you find." Before Amelia could respond, the room began to change. The walls shifted, the shadows deepening until they consumed everything. The other Amelia reached out, her hand brushing against Amelia's forehead. The touch sent a jolt through her body, and suddenly she wasn't in the room anymore. She was back at the manor, but it wasn't the same. The walls were decayed, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust. The air was heavy with the smell of rot. Amelia stood in the center of the entryway, clutching the diary in her hands. But this time she wasn't alone. A figure stood at the top of the staircase, its face obscured by shadow. "Do you remember now?" the voice asked, the same hollow rasp as before. Amelia's hands trembled as she opened the diary. The pages were blank at first, but words began to appear, written in her own handwriting. "I promised," the words read. "I broke it, and now it's come for me." The figure descended the stairs, each step echoing like a thunderclap. "What did I promise?" Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure stopped in front of her, leaning down until its face was inches from hers. Its features were a grotesque distortion, shifting and writhing as if it couldn't hold a single shape. "You promised to stay," it said. "But you ran. The memories came flooding back all at once. The manor, the diary, the ritual. She had been here before years ago. She had made a deal, one she thought she could escape. But no one escapes the manor. The figure reached out, its hand gripping her wrist with a cold, crushing force. "You have to finish what you started," it said. And with that, the floor gave way once more, plunging her into the darkness. Amelia's scream echoed into the abyss as she fell. This time, the descent felt endless, as though time itself had unraveled. The blackness around her was impenetrable, and the cold bit into her skin, deeper than any physical chill. When she landed, it wasn't on solid ground. She was suspended in a strange limbo, floating as if weightless. Before her, images began to form, memories she didn't want to see but couldn't look away from. The first image was of her as a child, standing outside the manor. She recognized the dress she was wearing, the bright red ribbon in her hair. She watched as her younger self clutched the diary tightly, looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to call her back. She came willingly, a voice murmured in the darkness. Amelia tried to respond, but her voice didn't come. The second memory showed her a little older, sitting inside the manor at a grand, rotting table. The diary was open before her, and she was writing feverishly. The ink glowed faintly, the same unnatural shimmer she had seen in the circular room earlier. What was I writing? She thought desperately. The memory shifted. Now she was running, the diary clutched to her chest. Tears streamed down her face, her breath coming in ragged sobs. The hallway behind her was alive, the walls bending and stretching as though trying to swallow her whole. She tried to escape, the voice said harsher now. The final memory was the worst. Amelia saw herself older, gaunt, her face hollow with despair. She stood in the manor's entryway, holding the diary out to an unseen figure. Her hands trembled as she spoke words Amelia couldn't hear. She broke the promise, the voice hissed, filled with venom. Amelia clutched her head, her mind spinning as the images dissolved into darkness once more. "No," she screamed. "I didn't mean to, whatever it was, I didn't mean to." The voice didn't respond. Instead, the darkness around her began to shift, solidifying into a new space. She was back in the manor, but this time it was alive. The walls pulsed like they were breathing, and the floor writhed beneath her feet. Shadows moved on their own, forming shapes that twisted and dissolved before she could fully comprehend them. The diary lay at her feet, open to a blank page. A figure emerged from the shadows, towering over her. Its form was ever-changing, flickering between human and monstrous, its voice a cacophony of whispers. "You must write," it said, its many voices overlapping. Amelia stumbled back. "What do you want from me?" "You made a deal," the figure said. "A life for a life. You wrote your promise in the book, and now you must finish it." "I don't even remember," she cried. The figure leaned closer, its face splitting into countless versions of her own, each one staring at her with accusing eyes. "You will," it said. "The diary remembers. And you will write until it's done." Amelia felt something cold in her hand. She looked down to see a pen, its ink glowing faintly like the words she'd seen before. Her hands moved on their own, the pen pressing to the diary's pages. Words poured out, written in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. As she wrote, the room around her shifted, the shadows coalescing into scenes. She saw a family, a mother, a father, and a little girl. The girl was her, but the parents' faces were blank. She saw them leave her at the gates of the manor, their voices echoing with promises she couldn't remember. "Why?" she whispered as she wrote. The pen moved faster, the ink flowing like blood onto the pages. The scenes became more vivid, more horrifying. She saw herself standing in a circle of candles, the diary open before her. A figure stood across from her, its hand extended. She took it, sealing the deal. "I just wanted to leave," her memory self said in the vision. "I didn't know what it would cost." "You wanted freedom," the monstrous figure said. "But you cannot take without giving." The shadows around her began to close in, their whispers turning into screams. Amelia dropped the pen, stumbling back from the diary. "I can't do this. I won't." The figure loomed over her, its many faces merging into one, a perfect reflection of her own. "It's too late," it said. "You are part of the manor now. Finish the story or it will finish you." The walls began to close in, the shadows consuming everything but the diary. Amelia felt the weight of the manor pressing down on her. the promise she had broken binding her like chains. And then she understood. She had written her own doom years ago, inscribing the deal in the diary without understanding the consequences. The manor had let her leave once, but only because it knew she would return. Amelia picked up the pen again, her hand trembling. "If I finish this, will it let me go?" The figure didn't answer. With a deep breath, she began to write. The ink flowed, the shadows surged, and the manor watched, waiting. Amelia's hand moved with a mind of its own, the pen scrawling across the diary's pages. The ink shimmered in the flickering light, bleeding into the paper like it was alive. The words weren't hers, they were forming without her understanding, each line a whisper of a memory she had buried deep. The room around her transformed with every sentence. The walls twisted, peeling away like rotting skin to reveal scenes from her past. But these weren't just memories, they were fractured truths distorted by the diary's power. She saw herself standing in the manor's entryway, years younger, clutching the diary to her chest. A figure stood across from her, draped in shadow, its form indistinct but overwhelmingly present. "You will write your promise," the figure had said in a voice like grinding stone. "And you will pay its price." Amelia's younger self had nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I just want to go home." The present Amelia gasped, her pen faltering as the scene dissolved. "This can't be real," she whispered. But the diary didn't stop. Her hand moved again, dragging the pen across the page in sharp, jagged strokes. The next memory unfolded, a candlelit room, the air thick with the stench of burning wax. She stood in the center of a circle, the diary open before her. Around her were figures, their faces obscured by black veils. They chanted in a language that scraped against her mind. "I didn't know," Amelia muttered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what it meant." The diary's pages flipped violently and the room shuddered. A new scene emerged, this one more horrifying than the last. It was a child, no older than 5, sitting in a small room with no windows. The child's face was eerily familiar. It was her, younger than she could remember. The child clutched the diary in her tiny hands, her lips moving as she whispered something inaudible. The shadowy figure appeared again, looming over the child. Its hand extended, long fingers brushing against the child's cheek. "You were always mine," the figure said. Amelia dropped the pen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not yours. I never was." The diary snapped shut, and the room plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the voice came again, closer this time, resonating in her skull. "Finish what you started." "I don't even know what I started," Amelia screamed. The shadows surged around her, forming into shapes, faces, hands, claws. They reached for her, pulling her down. "You wrote the promise," the voice hissed. "A life for a life. You broke the deal and now you must pay." The words echoed in her mind. A life for a life. Whose life had she taken? And whose had she promised in return? Memories flooded back, sharp and searing. She saw herself as a child, lonely and desperate, standing at the manor's gates. She had begged for something. What was it? Well, freedom? Safety? The words were lost to time, but the price was not. She remembered running away, clutching the diary as if it were her salvation. She remembered the whispers that followed her, the nightmares that plagued her. The manor had let her leave, but it had never released her. And now it wanted her back. The diary flew open again, the pages glowing with an unnatural light. The pen lifted itself, hovering before her like an executioner's blade. "You will write," the voice commanded. "No," she said, her voice firm despite the terror coursing through her. "Not this time." The room trembled, the shadows shrieking in rage. The diary's pages began to burn, the ink bubbling and hissing as flames consumed the words. Amelia stumbled to her feet, backing away as the shadows surged toward her. "I'm not your puppet anymore," she shouted. The pen flew toward her, but she caught it midair, snapping it in half. The diary screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that shook the room. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into smoke. The diary writhed on the floor, its pages turning to ash. For a moment, Amelia thought she had won. But then the voice came again, softer now, almost a whisper. "You cannot destroy what you are." The floor beneath her cracked, and she fell once more, this time into blinding light. Amelia awoke on the ground outside the manor. The air was crisp, the sky a pale gray. She sat up, her head pounding. The diary was gone, and the manor stood silent behind her, its windows dark and empty. But something was different. Her hands trembled as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. On it were 2 words, written in her own handwriting. "Remember me." Amelia stared at the note, her chest tightening. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew one thing. The manor wasn't done with her. Not yet. The silence outside the manor was unnerving. Amelia stared at the crumpled note in her hand, the words "remember me" etched in her own handwriting. They pulsed with meaning, yet she couldn't grasp it fully. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. The manor loomed behind her, quiet but alive, its dark windows watching her every move. She knew she should run, leave this cursed place and never look back. But something held her in place, a weight in her chest that refused to let go. She glanced down at the note again. The words seemed to shift on the paper, growing darker, more insistent. "Remember me." "Who are you?" she whispered. The wind answered with a low, mournful howl. Amelia stuffed the note into her pocket and turned away from the manor. She needed to think, to figure out what was happening. Her memories were fragmented, like shards of glass reflecting pieces of a life she didn't recognize. The path leading away from the manor was overgrown, the trees arching overhead like skeletal hands. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the manor's presence pressing against her back. But she didn't look back. The village at the edge of the forest was eerily quiet. The houses stood like sentinels, their windows dark and lifeless. Amelia felt a pang of familiarity as she walked the empty streets, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She stopped in front of a small shop, its sign faded and cracked. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. Something about the place tugged at her memory, but she couldn't place it. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the shelves lined with objects that seemed untouched for years. A faint hum filled the room, low and rhythmic like a heartbeat. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She moved deeper into the shop, her eyes scanning the cluttered shelves. Books, trinkets, jars filled with unidentifiable substances. They all seemed ordinary at first glance, but there was something off about them. Her gaze landed on a mirror at the back of the shop. Its surface was clouded, the frame ornate and weathered. She felt drawn to it, her feet moving on their own. When she stood before the mirror, her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't quite right. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her expression was one of despair. She reached out to touch the glass, and her reflection moved first. "Amelia," it said, its voice barely a whisper. She stumbled back, her heart racing. "Who are you?" The reflection smiled, a haunting, sorrowful smile. "You already know." The mirror began to ripple, the surface distorting like water. Amelia's reflection dissolved, replaced by an image of the manor. But this time it wasn't empty. The windows glowed with a faint, golden light, and shadows moved within. "Come back," the voice in the mirror said. Amelia shook her head. "No, I'm done with that place." The mirror darkened, the golden light fading into blackness. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "You can't leave. You never left." The mirror shattered, and Amelia screamed as the shards flew toward her. But instead of cutting her, they dissolved into mist, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. When the mist cleared, she was back in the manor. The entryway was as she remembered, grand and decayed, the air thick with the scent of rot. The diary lay on the floor in front of her, its pages pristine and untouched. "No," she whispered. "I left. I was gone." A figure emerged from the shadows, its form indistinct but undeniably human. It carried an air of familiarity, a presence that made Amelia's skin crawl. "You never left," the figure said, its voice a mixture of her own and something darker. "You've always been here." Amelia backed away, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" "I was outside. I walked away." The figure stepped closer, its shape shifting with each step. Sometimes it was her, sometimes it was the shadowy creature from her memories, and sometimes it was something else entirely. "You broke the deal," it said. "And the manor does not forgive." Amelia's mind raced. "What deal?" "I don't remember making any deal." The figure laughed, a hollow, echoing sound. "You made it long ago. You wanted freedom. You wanted a life that wasn't yours to take. And now the life you owe must be paid." The diary opened on its own, the pages flipping wildly until they settled on a single passage. The words glowed faintly, written in her handwriting. A life for a life. The manor gives and the manor takes. The debt will always be collected. Amelia's knees buckled and she fell to the floor. No, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't understand. The figure knelt before her, its face inches from hers. It was her face, but twisted, the eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. You did, it said. And now it's time to pay. The shadows surged around her, pulling her into the diary's pages. The last thing she saw was her own reflection, staring back at her with a look of resignation. And then there was nothing. Shall I continue with the consequences Amelia faces within the diary and the unfolding horror in the next chapter? Amelia opened her eyes to a world of paper. The ground beneath her feet felt fragile, crinkling with every step. The sky above was a swirling expanse of ink, shifting and roiling like a storm brewing on parchment. The realization struck her like a blow. She was inside the diary. The words she had written surrounded her, hanging in the air like ghostly whispers. She could see fragments of her own handwriting floating around her, their meanings distorted. Some sentences glowed faintly, their presence oppressive, while others were smeared as though they had been hastily erased. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the air, as omnipresent as the ink itself. Every word has weight, Amelia. Every sentence shapes the world you inhabit. You wrote your fate into existence. No, she shouted, her voice trembling. I didn't understand. I didn't know what I was doing. The voice ignored her protest. The price must be paid. The ink swirled around her feet, coalescing into shapes. Figures emerged from the liquid darkness, their forms flickering between solidity and mist. They were people, men, women, children, but their faces were blank, their features erased. Do you know them? The voice asked. Amelia shook her head, her chest tightening. No, I don't. Who are they? They are the ones you've written out of existence. Her breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? I couldn't. The voice grew sharper, accusatory. Your words are not mere scribbles, Amelia. They have power. Every story you've written has taken from the world to feed this one. The figures advanced toward her, their blank faces tilting as if to stare. One reached out, its hand dissolving into ink as it touched her arm. Cold seeped into her skin, and a wave of fragmented memories crashed over her. She saw herself as a child, sitting in the manor with the diary open before her. She was writing feverishly, her small hands gripping the pen so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The words on the page glowed, and with every line, the world around her seemed to shift. I was just writing stories, she whispered, horrified. You were taking lives, the voice said. Creating your world by destroying others. Amelia fell to her knees, her mind reeling. The figures closed in, their presence overwhelming. They whispered now, their voices overlapping, accusing. You stole my name. My family forgot me. I was erased. Tears streamed down her face as their accusations pierced her. I didn't know. I didn't mean to. The voice softened, almost mocking. Intent does not absolve you, Amelia. The manor gave you a gift and you used it recklessly. Now the scales must be balanced. The ink beneath her feet rippled, and a single figure stepped forward. Unlike the others, it had a face she recognized. It was her brother, Ethan. Amelia's heart stopped. She hadn't seen Ethan since she was a child, not since the day she left the manor. Ethan, she whispered, her voice breaking. He didn't respond. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and his expression blank. The memories hit her like a tidal wave. She had written about Ethan in the diary. She had been angry, jealous of the attention he received from their parents. In her childish frustration, she had scribbled a story about a boy who disappeared, swallowed by shadows. And then Ethan was gone. I didn't mean it, she sobbed, reaching out to him. I didn't know it would happen. I was just a kid. Ethan stared at her, unmoving. Then he opened his mouth, and the voice of the manor poured out. The debt is due, Amelia. Will you give yourself to repay it? She froze, her hand hovering in the air. If I do, will they all come back? She asked, her voice barely audible. The voice was silent for a moment, as if considering her question. Then it spoke, its tone final. Perhaps. The ink began to rise, pooling around her feet like a tide. It lapped at her legs, cold and unyielding, pulling her downward. Amelia clenched her fists, her mind racing. There has to be another way, she said. A way to fix this without? You are out of time, the voice said. Choose, or the manor will choose for you. The ink surged, climbing higher. The figures around her began to dissolve, their blank faces turning to shadows that melted into the rising tide. Amelia's breath came in shallow gasps as she fought to think. Her eyes darted around the ink-filled void, searching for anything, any clue, any escape. Her gaze landed on a faint light in the distance, barely visible through the swirling darkness. It pulsed weakly as though it were struggling to stay alive. Without hesitation she reached for it. The ink resisted, pulling at her limbs, but she forced herself forward, her determination overriding her fear. The light grew brighter as she approached, and she saw what it was. A page torn from the diary floating in the void. Her own handwriting covered the page, but the words were crossed out, chaotic and messy. Beneath them, faintly visible, was a single line of text she didn't recognize. The writer can rewrite. Amelia's heart leaped. She snatched the page, holding it tightly as the ink surged around her. The voice roared, its anger shaking the void. You cannot change what has been written. Yes, I can, she whispered, her voice growing stronger. If I wrote this world into existence, I can write it out. The ink lashed at her, but she clung to the page, focusing on the line of text. With trembling hands, she pressed the page against the void and began to write. Her words glowed as they formed, their power radiating outward. The ink recoiled, the voice screaming in rage. The figures around her began to reappear, their faces returning, their whispers turning to gasps of relief. Amelia's hand moved faster, her resolve unshakable. She wrote of a world without the manor, without its dark influence, without the curse that had claimed so many lives. The void began to crack, light pouring in from every fissure. The ink receded, and the voice faded into silence. As the final word was written, the page burst into light and everything went still. Amelia opened her eyes to find herself lying in a field. The sky above was clear, the air warm and filled with the sound of birds. The diary was gone, and so was the manor. She sat up, her heart pounding. For the first time in years she felt free. But as she reached into her pocket, her fingers brushed against something small and crumpled. She pulled it out, a note, written in her own handwriting. Remember me. Amelia stared at the note, her chest tightening. She wasn't sure who it was meant for, or if her story was truly over. The light faded, and Amelia found herself standing in a place that felt wrong. Her body still felt the echoes of the darkness she had just escaped, but now there was a heavy stillness in the air. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. The ground beneath her was smooth, almost like glass, stretching out in every direction until it met the edge of an endless horizon. The sky above was a dull, sickly shade of gray, as if the world was in perpetual twilight. Amelia blinked, disoriented. She turned around, expecting to see the forest she had just fought through, but there was nothing. No trees, no ground, just endless emptiness. The only thing that remained was a small, weathered door, standing alone in the middle of the expanse. The door was old, its wood warped and cracked, the paint peeling off in large, uneven strips. It looked like something from another time, something lost, forgotten. The handle was tarnished, yet when Amelia reached for it, it felt warm against her skin. Her heart raced as her fingers brushed against the handle. What is this place? For a brief moment, she considered walking away, pretending she hadn't seen it. But the door, its pull, was irresistible. It called to her. The whispering voice, the one that had followed her from the manor, echoed in her mind once again, louder this time. Remember me. The words felt like a knife to her chest. She knew deep down that this place, this door, was part of something much bigger, something she hadn't fully understood. Steeling herself, she turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but a pitch-black void beyond. Without thinking, she stepped through. The world around her shifted instantly. One moment, the emptiness had surrounded her, and the next, she was standing in a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old paper hung heavy. Bookshelves lined the walls, stacked with countless tomes, ancient books, their leather covers cracked and yellowed with age. A single candle flickered on a small desk in the corner, casting long, eerie shadows. She stepped forward, her breath quickening. This place felt familiar, yet alien. It was a room out of time, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. The The silence was deafening. Her eyes scanned the shelves, each book seemingly older than the last. One in particular caught her attention. Its cover was black, worn smooth with age, and it rested on a pedestal at the center of the room. She couldn't help but approach it. Her fingers hesitated as they brushed the cover. The title was simple yet chilling. The Chronicles of the Writer. The words seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, pulling her in. She opened the book. The pages inside were blank. At first, that didn't make sense to her. After everything she had been through, after the story she had rewritten, how could this book be empty? She felt the strange compulsion to write, to fill the void, but before she could, something caught her eye. On the back page, written in the same handwriting as her own, was a single line. The story never ends. Amelia froze, her fingers trembling. She wasn't sure how she knew, but she understood. This book was not merely a record of the past. It was a record of everything she had written, everything she had erased, and it was still writing itself. "You can't escape your story," the voice whispered again, this time unmistakable. "You are the writer, but you are also the story. And a story never ends until its author does." Amelia felt the room grow colder, darker. She slammed the book shut, but the voices, those whispers, didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic. The walls of the room began to pulse as if they were alive. Books flew off the shelves, pages fluttering in the air. The shadows seemed to creep closer, stretching toward her, wrapping around her like chains. "No," she gasped, her heart hammering in her chest. "No, this isn't how it's supposed to be." She could feel the weight of the book in her hands, its pages heavy with power. The voices in the room were becoming a cacophony, every single whisper pulling at her, dragging her down into the depths of the story she had created. Amelia stumbled backward, the floor beneath her feet shifting like sand, as if the very foundation of the world was crumbling. "You cannot escape what you have written." The shadows closed in, and in that instant, Amelia understood. She had thought she was rewriting her fate, changing the story, but the truth was far worse. The story had always been hers to control, but it was also controlling her. She was bound to it, trapped in the cycle of creation and destruction. And there was no way out. She looked down at the book once more, the words, "The Chronicles of the Writer," staring back at her with mocking clarity. Amelia's hands shook as she clutched the book to her chest, the weight of her decisions crushing her. The story never ends. Amelia closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She had tried to fight it, tried to escape, but there was no escape from the page. The shadows swarmed around her, and with a final, terrified scream, she was pulled into the darkness. Certainly. Here's an extended and expanded version of Chapter 7, keeping the suspense, emotional tension, and horror intact, while diving deeper into the story's resolution. Amelia was falling through the darkness that stretched endlessly, like an abyss that had no end. There were no sounds, no light, only the oppressive weight of her thoughts and the unsettling whisper that had been chasing her for so long. It came from the deep void, a murmur that seemed to have no source, no shape, but was as real as the air she gasped for. It was her own voice. No, not hers. Something else entirely, something ancient, endless. "You can never escape." The words wrapped around her mind like a shackle. Her heart pounded in her chest as she continued to fall, her body spinning uncontrollably. The fear in her gut was so sharp, so consuming, that it threatened to choke her. She had been running, fighting, trying to break free of the twisted narrative that had ensnared her. But here now, in this terrifying void, she felt the truth closing in. There was no escape. Not for her. Not from the story that she had both created and become trapped within. She tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed the sound, as if it had no place for such fragile things as words. Her arms flailed, reaching for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. Just the endless, spiraling void. She thought back to the book. The one she had found, the one with its cursed title, The Chronicles of the Writer. It had been more than just a book. It had been a mirror, showing her the truth she hadn't been able to see until now. The truth she hadn't wanted to accept. The whispers filled the space around her, now growing louder, closer, as if the darkness itself were trying to communicate with her, to drag her deeper into the folds of its twisted, never-ending existence. The story never ends. You can't escape it because it's you. Her mind raced. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be caught in this web of her own making. The door, she remembered the door. The one she had seen before, standing alone in the middle of that strange, empty space. It had been beckoning her, calling her. And despite the fear, despite the uncertainty she had stepped through, the moment she touched that door, everything had changed. Everything she had thought she understood about this world, about her own fate, had come crashing down. This wasn't just some cursed house, some twisted nightmare that she could simply walk away from. This was her story, her life, written by forces far beyond her comprehension. Every action, every decision had been leading her here to this very moment. Suddenly the fall stopped. It wasn't a gradual slow down, but a harsh, abrupt halt that left Amelia gasping for breath. The air around her was thick, suffocating, yet it was strangely still. She opened her eyes, her heart still racing. There was no longer the sensation of falling, no spinning chaos. Instead, she stood in an empty, desolate place. The ground beneath her feet was cracked, dry, and gray. It looked as if the very earth had been burned away, leaving only the remnants of a forgotten world. The sky above was an endless stretch of nothing. No stars, no clouds, just a dull, oppressive void. This wasn't just some eerie landscape, it was a place that felt wrong. A place out of time. A place where nothing could grow, nothing could survive. And there, in the middle of this bleak world, stood the door. The same door she had seen before, the one that had called her in the first place. But now, something was different about it. The door had no handle, no keyhole. It was sealed shut, and its surface was covered in dark, twisting symbols that seemed to shift and move on their own. The air around it crackled with a strange energy, and Amelia could feel the weight of its presence. It wasn't just a door. It was the doorway to the end. Amelia approached it slowly, her heart pounding, every step feeling heavier than the last. She knew this was the final moment. The door had to be opened. There was no other choice. But the fear that had been gnawing at her inside since she first stepped into this nightmare clawed at her once again. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the door. It was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt before. Her fingers recoiled as though burned, but she forced herself to make contact again. This time there was no hesitation. She had to know. She had to face whatever waited on the other side. As her fingers made contact, the symbols on the door began to glow, their eerie light pulsing with a strange rhythm. The air around her grew thick, oppressive, as though the very fabric of reality was warping. The whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. "You can't run from it, Amelia." The voice echoed, but it was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar that shook her to her core. "You can't escape this story. You've written yourself into it, and now, you will never leave." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to pull away, to turn and run. But there was nowhere to go. The truth had already been written. She pushed against the door, and with a groan that sounded like the earth itself was tearing apart, it swung open. On the other side was not another room, not another world. It was something far worse. It was a void, a blackness so deep that it swallowed everything, even light. Amelia felt herself drawn in, not by some outside force, but by the knowledge that she had no other choice. She had crossed the threshold, and there was no going back. As she stepped through, her surroundings shifted. She found herself standing in the middle of a massive, dark space. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsating with a life of their own. Every inch of this place was filled with energy, chaotic, uncontrollable, and terrifying. She could feel the weight of the history here, the stories that had been written and erased, the lives that had been lived and forgotten. It was a library, a massive archive of every story ever told. But this wasn't just any library. It was the library of all stories, past, present, and future. Every book here was a life, every page a choice made, every chapter a fate sealed. The books were old, their leather bindings cracked and worn, pages yellowed with age. Some were open, their pages flipping in an invisible wind. Others were closed, sealed, waiting to be read. Amelia walked through the aisles, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had done. She had written herself into this story, and now she had to face the consequences. Every decision she had made, every action she had taken, had brought her here. She was part of the story now, and no matter how hard she tried to escape, she would always be bound to it. She stopped in front of a book, its cover black and smooth. It was familiar. It was hers. The title read, "The Chronicles of the Writer." She opened it, her hands trembling. The pages were blank. But then, as she turned to the last page, she saw something. Words appeared, written in her own hand. "The story never ends." Her breath caught in her throat. She had thought she could escape. She had thought she could change the story, rewrite her fate. But the truth was clear now. There was no escaping the page. There was no way to change what had already been written. The story would continue with or without her. She was just another character, just another piece of a never-ending cycle. The whispers grew louder now, almost deafening. They surrounded her, filling her mind, her heart. "Remember me." And then, with a sudden, overwhelming force, everything went silent. The books, the walls, the void, they were all gone. Amelia was alone, suspended in a place that wasn't a place at all. She had written her own ending, and now there was nothing left to write. Story 3. The night was heavier than Sarah had ever felt before. Not just dark, but smothering, as if the sky itself had wrapped the world in a black veil. The kind of night where even the stars seemed afraid to shine. Her car headlights barely pierced the gloom as she navigated the winding, empty roads leading to the forgotten town. It was a place she hadn't heard of before, a name whispered in passing during her research for the project. A place with no real history to speak of, just a scattering of stories that no one could confirm or deny. She glanced at the GPS. The route felt endless, twisting and turning until the road seemed to dissolve into nothingness. Finally, the map said she had arrived, but Sarah could see no sign of civilization. Only a faint dirt path stretched ahead, shrouded by overgrown trees that arched together like skeletal hands. "This has to be wrong," she muttered, squinting into the darkness. But as she sat there debating whether to turn back, something flickered in the distance. A light. A single, weak glow that seemed to pulse faintly from somewhere up ahead. Against her better judgment, Sarah followed it. The house emerged from the shadows like a phantom. It wasn't just old, it was decaying, a relic from another century. Its weathered wood was stained black with rot, and jagged holes gaped in the roof, exposing the skeletal remains of its rafters. Shutters dangled by rusted hinges, creaking faintly as if groaning under the weight of their years. Yet, for all its dilapidation, the house seemed alive, almost as if it were watching her. Her car engine sputtered as she turned it off, leaving her in deafening silence. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She felt an irrational urge to lock the car doors and drive away, but then she thought of the email. It had been oddly specific, a rare collection of historical documents needing urgent restoration, delivered directly to her. The sender had offered a sum so generous it bordered on suspicious. But Sarah had bills to pay and a reputation to build, and curiosity had gotten the better of her. She needed the job. Steeling herself, she stepped out of the car. Her boots crunched against the gravel driveway, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. She hoisted her bag over her shoulder, her heart hammering as she approached the front porch. Each step up the creaking stairs felt heavier than the last. The porch was in disrepair, the boards beneath her feet sagging ominously. A dim, flickering light glowed faintly in the attic window. She froze, squinting upward. Was someone inside? Her rational mind told her it was just the moonlight playing tricks. But then it happened, a flicker, unmistakable this time, like someone lighting a match and letting it burn out. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. She hesitated, glancing back at her car. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe the job wasn't worth it. And then she heard it. A whisper. So faint it could have been the wind, but too deliberate to be natural. "Come in." Sarah jerked her head around, her pulse spiking. The street behind her was empty, the trees motionless. She licked her dry lips and tried to steady her breathing. The email had promised a key would be under the mat. But when she lifted it, all she found was a single rusted nail. She stared at the door, uncertainty gnawing at her resolve. But just as she decided to knock or leave, the door creaked open. The sight inside made her stomach tighten. Papers. Hundreds of them. Scattered across the floor in haphazard piles, as if someone had been rifling through them in a frenzy. The room smelled of mildew and something else, a sharp metallic tang that made her stomach churn. Her eyes caught on the bold, frantic handwriting scrawled across several sheets near her feet. The words weren't ancient records or historical notes. They were warnings. Get out while you can. A sudden gust slammed the door shut behind her, rattling the fragile walls. Sarah jumped, spinning around, her heart hammering in her chest. Her hand shot out for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The whisper came again, this time louder. Too late now. Her breath hitched as she stumbled backward, clutching the strap of her bag like a lifeline. The room seemed to stretch and shift around her, the shadows growing longer, darker. She felt the air thicken, pressing down on her chest. She fumbled for her phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But the screen stayed black, unresponsive no matter how hard she pressed the buttons. And then the light in the attic flickered again. It wasn't her imagination this time. Something, or someone, was up there. Hello? Her voice was barely above a whisper, her throat dry. Silence. She took a shaky step forward, scanning the room. The walls were lined with broken furniture, the remnants of a life long abandoned. But amidst the decay, she noticed something strange. The papers weren't just scattered, they formed a trail, a deliberate path leading deeper into the house. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, but the door behind her refused to budge. She was trapped. Her only option was to move forward. The floor groaned beneath her weight as she followed the trail, her footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but they were still indistinct, as if spoken in a language she couldn't understand. The trail led her to a narrow staircase at the back of the house. The steps were steep and uneven, their wood splintered with age. The flickering light from the attic cast eerie shadows, distorting the space around her. She hesitated at the base of the stairs, gripping the railing for support. Is someone up there? No answer. Only the creak of the house settling, and the whispers that seemed to seep from the very walls. She took the first step, her legs trembling. The stairs protested with each movement, their groans echoing like a warning. Halfway up, she paused, clutching her chest. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The air felt colder now, each breath visible in the dim light. When she reached the top, she was greeted by a single door. Unlike the rest of the house, this one looked new, its surface unervingly clean and unblemished. Her fingers brushed the doorknob, icy to the touch. She turned it slowly, her pulse racing as the door creaked open. The attic was empty. At least that's how it seemed at first glance. But as Sarah stepped inside, her gaze fell on the far corner of the room. A single chair sat in the shadows, facing the wall. And on that chair was a figure. Chapter 3, The House Knows. Sarah's scream died in her throat as the whispers surged, louder and more oppressive, like a storm circling her mind. She spun around, pressing her back against the door. Her eyes darted across the hallway, but nothing moved. No shadows, no figures, just the deafening cacophony of disembodied voices. Her chest heaved as she clutched at the doorknob behind her, desperate to escape. "Let me out," she shouted, her voice cracking. The house didn't answer, but she could feel it. Feel it watching her. The whispers grew more insistent, overlapping and meshing into a single phrase, repeating over and over. You don't belong here. You don't belong here. You don't belong here. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she staggered down the hallway, her hand brushing the wall for balance. She needed to think, to breathe. But the house refused to let her rest. A loud crash echoed from upstairs, like something heavy had fallen. She froze mid-step, her head snapping toward the staircase. "Hello?" she called out, hating the tremor in her voice. No response. Only the groaning of the old wood and the faint hum of the whispers that now seemed to seep into her skull. Sarah shook her head, biting down hard on her lip to stop herself from spiraling into panic. She forced herself to move, inching toward the staircase despite every fiber of her being screaming to stay away. She didn't want to go up there again, but she couldn't ignore the sound. Her hand trembled as she gripped the banister, the wood slick with a dampness that hadn't been there before. The stairs creaked louder than she remembered, each step feeling like a betrayal as the sound echoed through the house. When she reached the top, she paused. The door to the attic was still open, the light inside flickering weakly. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the smell. A sickly, metallic stench filled the air, so thick it burned her nostrils. She gagged, covering her mouth with her sleeve as her eyes watered. The hallway stretched before her, impossibly long. Doors that she hadn't noticed before now lined the walls, their dark wood gleaming as if freshly polished. Each door had a number carved into it, the marks deep and jagged. 1, 2, 3. The numbers went on, increasing with each door she passed. But the hallway didn't end. Her breathing quickened as she walked, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of her boots against the floorboards. The air felt colder with each step, and the stench grew stronger, making her stomach churn. Finally, she stopped in front of a door marked with the number 13. The door was different from the others. Older, its surface cracked and splintered. The brass handle was tarnished, streaked with dark, rust-like stains. A chill ran down her spine as she reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. She didn't want to open it. Every instinct told her to turn back, to run. But the whispers, they had stopped. The silence was almost worse. Swallowing hard, Sarah turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside was a single object, a mirror. It stood in the center of the room, tall and ornate, its gilded frame covered in intricate carvings of twisting vines and grotesque faces. The glass was cracked, jagged lines spiderwebbing across its surface. Her reflection stared back at her, distorted by the cracks. But something was wrong. The reflection wasn't moving. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She raised her hand, but the reflection didn't mimic the movement. Instead, it stared at her, its expression blank and lifeless. And then it smiled. A slow, unnatural grin spread across the reflection's face, the corners of its mouth stretching far too wide. Its eyes darkened, sinking into hollow pits that seemed to pull her in. Sarah stumbled backward, her pulse racing. The reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. The mirror began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that made the floor beneath her feet tremble. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her. She was trapped. The hum grew louder, filling her head with a relentless, droning noise that made it impossible to think. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. And then the reflection spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice warped and echoing, as though it were speaking from the depths of a cavern. Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean to." The reflection laughed, a hollow, bone-chilling sound. "It doesn't matter. The house chose you. And now you belong to it." The glass began to crack further, the jagged lines spreading like veins. Dark liquid seeped from the fractures, dripping onto the floor in thick, sluggish drops. Sarah backed away, her back hitting the wall as the mirror began to shake violently. The reflection's grin widened, its teeth sharp and gleaming. "Run," it whispered. Before she could react, the mirror shattered. The room went dark, and the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. Sarah screamed as she felt something brush against her arm, cold, skeletal fingers gripping her wrist. She thrashed, struggling to free herself, but the grip tightened, pulling her toward the center of the room. And then she saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their faces twisted and incomplete. Some had no eyes, others had mouths that stretched far too wide, their teeth glinting in the dim light. They surrounded her, their hands reaching, pulling, dragging her toward the spot where the mirror once stood. The floor began to give way beneath her feet, the wood splintering and crumbling. Below was nothing but darkness, a gaping void that seemed to go on forever. Sarah clawed at the walls, screaming, but it was no use. The figures dragged her closer to the edge, their hollow eyes staring into her soul. As she fell, the last thing she heard was the house itself, whispering softly, "You're home now. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 4, or do you want to discuss or tweak anything before moving forward?" Silence. She took a cautious step forward, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Her instinct screamed at her not to open it, but she had no choice. If she stayed here, the faceless thing would find her eventually. She turned the knob slowly, inching the door open just enough to peek outside. The hallway was empty, the shadows still and undisturbed. But something wasn't right. The scattered papers were gone, the floor now bare as if they had never been there. And the whispers, those dreadful, overlapping voices, had fallen silent. The house was holding its breath. Sarah stepped into the hallway, every nerve in her body on edge. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. She glanced up the staircase, half expecting to see the figure again, but it was empty. Her eyes darted to the front door. It was ajar. Relief flooded her as she sprinted toward it, her boots thudding against the wooden floor. She reached for the handle, her fingers brushing the cold metal. The door slammed shut in her face with a deafening bang. And behind her, the whispers began again. "You can't leave. She's here. She sees you." Sarah's scream died in her throat as the whispers surged, louder and more oppressive, like a storm circling her mind. She spun around, pressing her back against the door. Her eyes darted across the hallway, but nothing moved. No shadows, no figures, just the deafening cacophony of disembodied voices. Her chest heaved as she clutched at the doorknob behind her, desperate to escape. "Let me out," she shouted, her voice cracking. The house didn't answer, but she could feel it watching her. The whispers grew more insistent, overlapping and meshing into a single phrase, repeating over and over. You don't belong here. You don't belong here. You don't belong here. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she staggered down the hallway, her hand brushing the wall for balance. She needed to think, to breathe. But the house refused to let her rest. A loud crash echoed from upstairs, like something heavy had fallen. She froze mid-step, her head snapping toward the staircase. "Hello?" she called out, hating the tremor in her voice. No response. Only the groaning of the old wood and the faint hum of the whispers that now seemed to seep into her skull. Sarah shook her head, biting down hard on her lip to stop herself from spiraling into panic. She forced herself to move, inching toward the staircase despite every fiber of her being screaming to stay away. She didn't want to go up there again, but she couldn't ignore the sound. Her hand trembled as she gripped the banister, the wood slick with a dampness that hadn't been there before. The stairs creaked louder than she remembered, each step feeling like a betrayal as the sound echoed through the house. When she reached the top, she paused. The door to the attic was still open, the light inside flickering weakly. But that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the smell. A sickly, metallic stench filled the air, so thick it burned her nostrils. She gagged, covering her mouth with her sleeve as her eyes watered. The hallway stretched before her, impossibly long. Doors that she hadn't noticed before now lined the walls, their dark wood gleaming as if freshly polished. Each door had a number carved into it, the marks deep and jagged. The numbers went on, increasing with each door she passed. But the hallway didn't end. Her breathing quickened as she walked, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of her boots against the floorboards. The air felt colder with each step, and the stench grew stronger, making her stomach churn. Finally, she stopped in front of a door marked with the number 13. The door was different from the others. Older, its surface cracked and splintered. The brass handle was tarnished, streaked with dark, rust-like stains. A chill ran down her spine as she reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. She didn't want to open it. Every instinct told her to turn back, to run. But the whispers, they had stopped. The silence was almost worse. Swallowing hard, Sarah turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside was a single object, a mirror. It stood in the center of the room, tall and ornate, its gilded frame covered in intricate carvings of twisting vines and grotesque faces. The glass was cracked, jagged lines spider-webbing across its surface. Her reflection stared back at her, distorted by the cracks. But something was wrong. The reflection wasn't moving. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She raised her hand, but the reflection didn't mimic the movement. Instead, it stared at her, its expression blank and lifeless. And then it smiled. A slow, unnatural grin spread across the reflection's face, the corners of its mouth stretching far too wide. Its eyes darkened, sinking into hollow pits that seemed to pull her in. Sarah stumbled backward, her pulse racing. The reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. The mirror began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that made the floor beneath her feet tremble. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her. She was trapped. The hum grew louder, filling her head with a relentless, droning noise that made it impossible to think. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. And then the reflection spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice warped and echoing, as though it were speaking from the depths of a cavern. Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean to." The reflection laughed, a hollow, bone-chilling sound. "It doesn't matter. The house chose you. And now you belong to it." The glass began to crack further, the jagged lines spreading like veins. Dark liquid seeped from the fractures, dripping onto the floor in thick, sluggish drops. Sarah backed away, her back hitting the wall as the mirror began to shake violently. The reflection's grin widened, its teeth sharp and gleaming. "Run," it whispered. Before she could react, the mirror shattered. The room went dark, and the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. Sarah screamed as she felt something brush against her arm, cold, skeletal fingers gripping her wrist. She thrashed, struggling to free herself, but the grip tightened, pulling her toward the center of the room. And then she saw them. Figures emerging from the shadows, their faces twisted and incomplete. Some had no eyes, others had mouths that stretched far too wide, their teeth glinting in the dim light. They surrounded her, their hands reaching, pulling, dragging her toward the spot where the mirror once stood. The floor began to give way beneath her feet, the wood splintering and crumbling. Below was nothing but darkness, a gaping void that seemed to go on forever. Sarah clawed at the walls, screaming, but it was no use. The figures dragged her closer to the edge, their hollow eyes staring into her soul. As she fell, the last thing she heard was the house itself, whispering softly, "You're home now." Sarah woke with a jolt, gasping for air as though she had been drowning. Her chest heaved, and the bitter taste of blood lingered in her mouth. She blinked, disoriented, her vision adjusting to a dim red glow that surrounded her. The air was suffocatingly thick, heavy with the stench of decay and rot. She wasn't in the attic, the hallway, or the parlor anymore. She was somewhere else entirely. The ground beneath her was cold, rough stone, slick with a strange, sticky substance that clung to her skin. The walls were made of crumbling bricks, covered in black moss that pulsed faintly as if alive. Chains hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly though there was no breeze. Sarah's heart raced as she sat up, wincing at the sharp pain in her side. Her hands trembled as she touched her face, relieved to find it intact. But the relief was short-lived as her surroundings came into sharper focus. This wasn't just a room, it was a dungeon. Groaning, she pushed herself to her feet, the chains above her clinking softly as though mocking her. The eerie red light seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, casting long, flickering shadows that danced in unnatural patterns. What is this place? As she staggered forward, her foot hit something solid. She looked down and nearly screamed. A skeleton, its bony fingers still clutching the rusted remains of a metal chain, lay slumped against the wall. Its jaw hung open as if frozen in a silent scream. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to keep moving. She couldn't stay here. Whatever had dragged her into this nightmare wasn't done with her yet. The whispers began again, faint and distant, echoing through the stone corridor ahead of her. Sarah? Her blood ran cold. The whispers knew her name. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The only response was the soft, rhythmic tapping of footsteps coming from somewhere in the distance. They weren't hers. Panic clawed at her throat as she backed away, pressing herself against the wall. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was all she could hear. And then it stopped. The silence was deafening. She held her breath, her ears straining for any sound, any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, stretching across the corridor. It moved unnaturally, as though the figure casting it wasn't walking but gliding. Sarah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had to move. Staying still was a death sentence. She darted down the corridor, her footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The shadows seemed to shift and stretch as she ran, reaching for her like skeletal hands. The air grew colder with each step, and the red glow dimmed until she was plunged into near total darkness. Ahead, a faint light flickered, a pale, sickly green that illuminated the outline of a heavy wooden door. She sprinted toward it, her lungs burning as she pushed herself forward. Her hands fumbled with the rusted iron handle, the metal biting into her palms as she yanked it open. The door creaked loudly, the sound reverberating through the corridor like a scream. She stumbled inside and slammed the door shut behind her, leaning against it as she gasped for breath. The light in the room was dim, but it was enough to see by. This room was different. Unlike the dungeon-like corridor, it had the semblance of a study. Shelves lined the walls, filled with crumbling books and strange artifacts. A massive desk sat in the center, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers, ink bottles, and a single lit candle that burned with a greenish flame. But what drew Sarah's attention most was the painting on the far wall. It was a portrait of a man, his features sharp and aristocratic, with deep-set eyes that seemed to follow her no matter where she stood. His expression was cold, almost sneering, and his hands rested on the back of a high-backed chair. But the chair wasn't empty. Sitting in it was the faceless figure. Sarah's stomach dropped as she stared at the painting, her mind racing. How could it be here? Was this some kind of warning? A trap? She approached the desk cautiously, her fingers brushing against the papers. Most of the writing was illegible, the ink smudged and faded, but a single page stood out. The words were written in bold, jagged letters, and as she read them, a chill ran down her spine. The house is alive. It feeds on fear, on despair. Those who enter cannot leave. They become part of it. Her hands shook as she dropped the paper, her gaze snapping back to the painting. The faceless figure was gone. The chair in the painting was empty now. A soft creak behind her made her blood run cold. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. There, standing in the doorway, was the figure. Its faceless head tilted slightly as though mocking her fear. The air grew heavier, suffocating as it took a step forward. "No," Sarah whispered, backing away. "Stay back." It didn't stop. Her eyes darted around the room, desperate for anything she could use to defend herself. Her gaze landed on a silver dagger lying among the clutter on the desk. Without thinking, she grabbed it, the cool metal reassuring in her hand. The figure paused, its head tilting in the opposite direction. It seemed almost amused. Sarah gritted her teeth, raising the dagger. "I'm not afraid of you," she lied, her voice trembling. The figure's head snapped upright, and for a moment, everything was still. Then it lunged. Sarah screamed, slashing wildly with the dagger as the figure closed the distance between them. The blade sliced through its arm, and the figure recoiled, a strange, dark substance oozing from the wound. But it didn't stop. It grabbed her wrist with a grip like iron, yanking her forward. The room seemed to spin, the walls warping and twisting as the green light flared brighter and brighter. She felt herself falling again, the floor vanishing beneath her feet. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping until they were a single, guttural roar. And then silence. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Ones. The silence was suffocating. Sarah's body was weightless, as though she were floating in an endless void. Her eyes fluttered open, but there was nothing to focus on. Only darkness, an oppressive blackness that seemed to swallow everything around her. She gasped for air, but her lungs refused to fill. The more she tried to breathe, the more it felt as though the darkness was squeezing the life out of her. Her chest tightened, and the edges of her vision blurred, as if her very existence were being erased. Am I dead? The thought flickered in her mind, but she immediately rejected it. She couldn't be. She couldn't let herself be. There had to be a way out. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the void. Nothing. A sudden sharp pain shot through her chest, breaking through the numbness. She gasped, her heart racing as her limbs began to tingle with life. The darkness seemed to recoil from the pain, retreating, fading as if it were afraid. And then, light. At first, it was just a glimmer, a faint glow on the horizon of her vision. But it grew stronger, illuminating the space around her. The oppressive void began to dissolve, revealing what looked like an ancient, crumbling hallway. The walls were lined with doorways, their frames thick with dust and cobwebs. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay, the familiar dampness of the house that had once been her prison. The house. The thought struck her like a cold knife, and she stumbled to her feet, her legs shaky beneath her. Her hands shook as she wiped the sweat from her forehead, but she knew she had to keep moving. The house had done this to her. It had brought her here. There was no turning back. She started down the hallway, each step slow and deliberate, her eyes darting from one shadowed doorway to the next. The whispers from earlier were gone, but she could still feel them, echoing faintly in the back of her mind. You belong here. It was a voice, familiar and strange at once. She couldn't place it, but it was undeniable, an unsettling presence that made her skin crawl. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, but it didn't feel like she had any choice but to continue forward. The doors, though all different in size and shape, seemed to call to her. Finally, she stopped in front of one. It was smaller than the others, made of dark, polished wood, its surface intricately carved with symbols she didn't understand. It looked older than the house itself, and that made her stomach turn, as if it were a trap. She reached out for the doorknob, but before her fingers touched the cold metal, a low, guttural voice whispered from within. Don't open it. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was familiar. It was almost human, but it wasn't. With a shaky hand, she gripped the knob and twisted. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in pale, flickering light. The walls were lined with old, weathered portraits, each one depicting a face she couldn't quite place. They all seemed to be watching her, their eyes following her every move. In the center of the room stood a large, cracked mirror. The reflection it offered was not her own, but the face of a man, pale, gaunt, his eyes hollow and sunken. His lips were drawn into a thin, cruel smile. It was him, the man from the painting. Her heart skipped a beat as the realization hit her. This was the man whose portrait she had seen earlier in the study. But now, in the mirror, he was alive. Or at least he appeared to be. His eyes locked onto hers, and the smile on his face widened as though he recognized her too. Why does he look at me like that? Who are you? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The man in the mirror didn't answer. Instead, his smile grew even wider, his teeth sharp and elongated, like something inhuman. Suddenly, the mirror began to warp, the glass rippling as if it were made of water. The man's form shifted, his face twisting into something grotesque, unrecognizable. Sarah staggered back, horrified, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The whispers grew louder again, filling her mind with a maddening chorus of voices, all saying the same thing. You belong to us. All of you. Forever. Before she could react, the man in the mirror reached out, his hand pressing against the glass. But instead of simply touching the surface, his hand went through it. With a sudden, jerking motion, the man's hand shot out, grabbing Sarah's wrist. His grip was cold, unnaturally cold, and his fingers felt like bones wrapped in leather. Let go of me, Sarah screamed, struggling against the icy grip. But the man's hand tightened, pulling her toward the mirror, drawing her closer to the twisted reflection. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to break free. The glass seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, vibrating violently as though it were alive. I don't belong here, she cried, her voice breaking. But the man only laughed. His laugh was hollow, a sound that seemed to echo from every corner of the room. It sent a wave of terror crashing over her. The room began to darken, the light from the flickering lanterns sputtering out as the mirror grew larger, swallowing the space around them. The grip on her wrist tightened, and before she could even blink, Sarah was pulled into the mirror. For a moment, everything was a blur. The world around her twisted, contorted, and stretched like a living nightmare. She felt herself falling into a space where time had no meaning, where nothing made sense. Then silence. She landed on cold, hard stone, the impact knocking the breath out of her lungs. As she gasped for air, she realized she was no longer in the room with the mirror. She was somewhere else entirely. The air was thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence. The walls were covered in bloodstains, the floors slick with something dark and viscous. A faint, sickly green glow illuminated the space, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she looked up. The man was there, standing in the center of the room, his pale face staring down at her with a twisted, predatory smile. Welcome, he said, his voice as cold as death. You are one of us now. And then the whispers returned. Louder. Angrier. You belong here. Forever. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, each beat echoing like a drum in the suffocating silence of the room. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, her limbs frozen in place. The man in front of her stood motionless, his pale eyes never leaving her face, his lips curling into that same menacing smile. You're not real, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, trembling with fear. The man's smile only widened in response, his thin, almost skeletal hands moving slowly, as though savoring the moment. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to bore into her soul, his gaze not just unsettling but suffocating. Real? His voice was a low murmur like the rustling of dead leaves. You think this is some kind of illusion? Some kind of dream? His fingers curled into claws, and as he took a slow step toward her, the air in the room seemed to grow colder, heavier. The walls, once covered in bloodstains and grime, now seemed to pulse with an unseen energy as though they were alive, watching her. Sarah stumbled back, her eyes darting around the room. It was a nightmare, an inescapable prison, and the man was its cruel warden. How do I escape this? Her thoughts raced as she looked around for anything that could help. The walls were bare except for the strange symbols etched into the stone, markings that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. They felt alive, watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. No one escapes, the man continued, his voice cold and sharp as though reading her thoughts. Not from here. Not from this place. She didn't want to hear his voice, didn't want to believe his words, but they gnawed at her, scratching away at her resolve. No one escapes. Those words echoed in her mind like a haunting mantra. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she tried to steady herself. She had to think. She had to find a way out because standing still, letting the terror consume her, wasn't going to save her. Her eyes landed on something in the corner of the room, a door. A small, weathered door, barely noticeable against the stone walls, its frame chipped and worn. The door was old, with a single rusted lock that looked as though it had been untouched for decades. That was it. That was her chance. Without a second thought, Sarah ran toward it, her legs shaking with every step. The man's laughter followed her, a mocking, low chuckle that seemed to reverberate from the very walls around her. "You think that door will save you?" His voice was everywhere, filling the room, slithering into her thoughts. "You'll never escape. You'll never leave. You are already ours." Her heart raced, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she reached the door and threw her weight against it. But to her horror, it didn't open. The door wouldn't budge. Panicked, Sarah pulled at the rusted handle, yanking with all her strength, but the door refused to move. The lock was sealed tight, and there was no way in hell she was going to break it open. She turned desperately toward the man, her voice cracking as she shouted, "Why are you doing this? Why me?" The man's smile faded, his expression turning colder, more intense. He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes flashed with an unsettling gleam, and he began to move toward her again, his slow, deliberate steps sending waves of dread crashing over her. Suddenly, the air around her shifted, the temperature plummeting even further. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch longer, like tendrils reaching out to claim her. The walls felt closer now, pressing in from all sides as though the room itself was alive and hungry. Sarah's pulse quickened. She needed to act. She needed to do something, anything, to stop the suffocating presence closing in on her. Her eyes flicked to the symbols on the walls. They seemed to writhe, shifting in the dim light as though they were not part of the room at all, but rather something otherworldly, something that didn't belong. A thought sparked in her mind. What if the symbols weren't just markings? What if they were some kind of warning? She didn't know what they meant, but she had no choice. She had to try. In a desperate, wild move, Sarah reached out and traced one of the symbols with her finger. To her surprise, the moment her skin made contact with the stone, a sharp, searing pain shot through her hand. She cried out, but the pain didn't stop. It spread, radiating through her arm and up to her chest, as though the symbol was alive and feeding on her. The pain was unbearable, and for a moment, Sarah thought she would pass out from it. But then something shifted. The stone around the symbol began to glow, a faint, eerie blue light that flickered like a dying flame. The man stopped in his tracks, his expression darkening as the glow intensified. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time since Sarah had entered this nightmare, there was a flicker of fear in his gaze. "Stop," he hissed. "You don't know what you're doing." But it was too late. The room seemed to tremble as the symbols on the walls began to shift and twist, rearranging themselves into new patterns, new shapes. The air crackled with energy, and Sarah could feel it. The power, the raw force of something ancient and forbidden. The man lunged at her, but the moment his hands reached for her, a wave of energy surged through the room, blasting him back. He slammed into the wall with a sickening thud, and for a moment, Sarah thought he had been thrown into another dimension. But when he rose, there was no longer a trace of fear in his expression. Instead, there was only rage. "You think you've won?" The man's voice was a low, guttural growl. "You have no idea what you're up against." Suddenly, the floor beneath Sarah's feet cracked open, and black tendrils shot up from the depths below. They wrapped around her legs, pulling her toward the ground. Panic surged through her as she tried to break free, but the tendrils tightened, their grip like iron. Her vision blurred as she was dragged toward the floor, the man's laughter filling her ears, growing louder and louder, until it was all she could hear. "I told you," he said, his voice cold and final. "No one leaves." The darkness closed in on her, and she screamed. The darkness was suffocating, but it was different now. The black tendrils that had pulled Sarah down into the earth felt like a physical weight, their grip tightening around her body, pulling her deeper into the abyss. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat seeming to echo off the walls of her mind. She gasped for breath, her lungs burning, but no air came. It felt as though the room itself had turned into a trap, a living thing designed to devour her whole. Her hands grasped at the floor, desperate to find something, anything, that might help her escape. The walls around her were a blur of shifting shadows, and above her, the man's laughter rang out, cold and mocking. "You thought you could fight it," he sneered, his voice a constant, low growl, as though he were everywhere at once. "But there is no escape from this place. There is no escape from us." Sarah's eyes darted to the door, the one she had tried to open earlier. It was still there, standing in the far corner of the room, taunting her. The man had said it wouldn't open, but now she wasn't sure if she cared. If she was going to die here, if she was going to disappear into whatever nightmare this place was, then at least she would face it head on. But the door, it had to open. A sudden, sharp pain shot through her arm as one of the tendrils wrapped around it, its icy touch feeling like death itself. She screamed, thrashing, but the tendril tightened, dragging her closer to the floor. She could feel herself slipping, falling. Into what? "Stop fighting," the man hissed, his voice rising from somewhere in the darkness. "You're ours now. You've always been ours." The room seemed to bend around her as her vision blurred, her breath quickening. She felt herself sinking, falling further into the darkness, but then, as though from a great distance, something inside of her snapped. A sudden surge of adrenaline surged through Sarah's veins. She refused to let herself go. Not yet. She couldn't. Her eyes locked onto the door again. The door was the key. "I can't give up. I won't give up." With everything she had left, Sarah used all her strength to wrench herself free from the tendrils that had begun to drag her under. She kicked, she pulled, and she fought with every ounce of energy in her. It felt impossible, like she was fighting against the very essence of the house itself. But she was determined. And then, just like that, the tendrils loosened. For a split second, she was free. She scrambled to her feet, her legs weak, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Her eyes locked onto the door again, and despite the oppressive darkness surrounding her, despite the eerie whispers that filled her ears, she ran. Her legs felt like lead, but the adrenaline carried her forward, and before she knew it, her hands were on the doorknob, twisting it with everything she had left. The door creaked, its rusted hinges protesting, but it opened. Light. Brilliant light flooded into the room as the door swung open, illuminating everything. The blackness seemed to recoil from the light, shrinking back as though it were afraid of what lay beyond. For a moment, Sarah was paralyzed, staring into the blinding light, unsure of what to do. But then the man's voice broke through her thoughts, low and deadly. "Don't step through that door, Sarah." It was a warning, a threat. The sound of it chilled her to her very core, but she knew deep down that this was her only chance. Without another thought, she stepped through. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air shifted. The darkness didn't follow her. It was as though the door had severed the connection. The room she found herself in was not the same one she had left behind. It was an empty, cold hallway, one that stretched far beyond her line of sight. It was quiet here, dead silent. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let herself stop. Sarah staggered down the hallway, her mind racing. What was this place? What had she just escaped from? Had she really escaped? Was she truly free? Her eyes flicked nervously behind her, but there was nothing. The door she had just passed through had vanished. The hallway was empty and it felt wrong. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She walked faster, trying to make sense of what had happened, of where she was. There was no sound here, no whispers, no footsteps, nothing. Just the oppressive silence. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow. It flitted just out of sight, a fleeting movement that sent her heart racing. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. The shadow moved again, this time more clearly. It was a figure, tall, its features indistinct, like a person made of the very darkness around her. It stood at the end of the hallway watching her. Sarah's blood ran cold. She wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in her throat. She was trapped again. But no, she wasn't going to let this happen. Not again. With every ounce of strength she had, she turned and ran. She didn't care what was chasing her. She didn't care what this place was anymore. All she knew was that she had to escape. Her footfalls echoed through the empty hall, growing louder with every step, her breathing ragged. The shadow didn't follow, not yet. She ran faster, her mind a blur, her body on autopilot. There had to be an exit, there had to be a way out. And then, just as her strength was beginning to fail, she saw it. A light ahead. A door. Without thinking, she sprinted toward it, her hands outstretched, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. The door was old, rusted, but it would open. It had to. Her hand closed around the knob and she twisted it. The door swung open. And then everything went black.